If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
We have General McGill here again. McGill Alexander, the paratrooper. I think by now you got used to him. And I must thank you for all your comments, very positive. Thank you for that. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate you. Your story is magnificent. There's no other word for it. And I think last week, with a hostage drama, that's the best one I've ever heard in my life. On legacy anywhere else. From a viewpoint of faith, I can't think there can be a better testimony than that outside the Bible. So thank you for that, sir. It was a real honor and privilege to hear that from you yourself. And now it's over to you. You can tell us now what happened further. You're out of Taiwan, I suppose, and you're still not done with the army.
No, I still had a good 10 years to go before I reached retirement. Of course, thank you, and thank you for your kind words. It's a privilege for me to, and I feel humbled to be able to share this experience of what did happen to us in Taiwan, particularly with the audience that you have on this forum. I must say that, you know, having looked for the links to be able to enable people to watch the docudramas that were the two that were produced on our experience, I looked at those again, and I realized, you know, the passage of years, one's some detail tends to fade in one's mind, and one gets a few things wrong. And I realized that when I looked at those, that one or two things that I had said, minor things, but I got the sequence of things a little bit wrong. You know, for example, I realized, having watched those, that it wasn't the police that fired the first shot. It was Chen who was goaded by the police and eventually fired the first shot, and then the police reacted. But you know, when I was reminded of that, when I saw those videos, which were made at the time much closer to the event, and when we related what happened there, and of course I wrote the book, and I was very careful to try and get everything as correctly as I could from what sources I had, and that confirmed it as well. So, you know, and the other thing was that Melanie wasn't the first one that was evacuated. It was me who was evacuated first, and then they came back and fetched Melanie. But, you know, those are little things. They don't make any difference to the actual story. But and as a historian of sorts, I should know better than that, because I'd found in the research that I've done that, as I often put it, memory is one of the most dubious of sources. Unless you have documentation or photographic or other verification, in other words, several people who can verify exactly the same thing has happened, the one person's memory tends to be quite an unreliable source. And that's why I try with these conversations to just refresh my memory a little bit and check a few documents and go through some things so that I get things reasonably accurate and correct. And certainly if I was writing a book on the things that I've spoken about now, it would take me a very long time, because I would sit down and research to get things exactly correct. You know, I suppose that as time goes by, and your memory bank gets old and rusty, you do lose some of the detail. And I found with interviews that I've had with people that as they think back on the past, sometimes the memory fades, and sometimes they get things a little wrong and sometimes mixed up, because events in the past, they go so far back that for some people they actually merge, and people will describe things to you And then you go down and you check it on documents, archival documents and so on, and you find out that what he was telling you, he wasn't trying to embellish his story. He wasn't trying to lie to you. But what he's telling you didn't actually happen there. It happened at a different occasion. And there might have been 2 or 3 years in between those. But in his mind, with all the things that have happened to him, the memories have merged. And, you know, it's easier for your mind just to lump all these things together, and you think they all happened over there, and actually they happened in different places. So memory is a bit of an unreliable source, but it's a very important source, because provided you can verify those things, you can actually lend a far more color to the far more personal aspect to the history than just writing plain history. It becomes plain history, becomes clinical and becomes boring, and it's difficult to concentrate on it. You know, it's just a matter of places and dates and the bare skeleton of the outline. But when people start telling you their memories and you can latch it onto the actual history, it makes the history come alive and it becomes far more interesting. So, and I should have realized that but of course my memory also gets rusty like anyone else's. So I thought I'd just mention that, you know, it was 25 years ago, so one does tend to forget some things. What I do want to say is that when I left Taiwan, and after the fantastic homecoming, you know, when we were welcomed by the crowds consisting of exactly one woman who met us at the airport, I then, you know, we got into our vehicle and we drove up to Petersburg, which was where I'd been told, this is where you're going to. You're becoming the SSO operations at Far North Command. The general officer commanding up there was a Major General Van Grobbelaar, who was a sapper. I knew him, but I didn't know him well. We had a bit of a relationship indirectly. He had been the military attaché in Spain, but not at the time that I was there. But he knew many of the people in Spain that I knew, and so we had a little bit of a common ground around that. And I got on very well with him. I worked very well under him. His chief of staff was Brigadier Junior Botha, who I knew very well and who I had known when he was at the Directorate of Operations while I was at the Parachute Brigade. And he'd always been, he wasn't a paratrooper himself, but he'd always been amazingly supportive of the paratroopers. And, you know, we always appreciated his attitude towards us. At a later stage, he was also the PSO of the Chief of the Army. You know, he was I'd also worked with him on one operation when he was appointed as the second in command of 6-1 Mech for an operation we did into Angola, and I was one of the company commanders. So I knew Junior Botha quite well, and it was nice to actually be appointed to a headquarters with him. And as he was the chief of staff and I was the SSO ops, we worked quite closely together. Almost all the staff in the Far North Command, although we were now, 98, so it was 4 years into democracy, and integration had been taking place. There hadn't been a lot of transformation yet, and almost the entire headquarters consisted of former SADF people. I think most of the MK and UPLA people that were busy integrating were vying for positions in Pretoria where they would have maximum influence and, you know, possibly get some of the higher appointments. So in a little backwater like Petersburg, as it was then, it's Polokwane now, but it was still Petersburg then. And as Petersburg was back then, it was pretty much regarded by most people as a sort of a backwater. There was no longer a war on, and its role had diminished, and it no longer, like most of the territorial commands, they didn't really require a major general in command anymore. But I think that, like the Transkei Defence Force, which when they saw that integration was going to take place, they promoted all their officers one rank, so that a guy who just before integration took place was a colonel would come in as a brigadier, and the brigadiers would come in as major generals, and so on. So that happened with a lot of them, and I don't think the SADF was innocent in this. I think our war was, so to say, over. There was still a lot of internal unrest and so on, but I really don't think that the territorial commands required major generals. They'd had brigadiers for years and years and years during some of the worst unrest that had taken place in South Africa, and the brigadiers seemed to manage it quite well. But suddenly they were all risen in rank to major general. And I suppose that had something to do with it as well. The guys at the top probably felt that our senior officers also needed to be on a good footing when the integration took place. I found the staff at Far North Command to be very professional. They were all old SADF soldiers. They knew their jobs. They were dedicated. They worked hard. The team of officers and NCOs I had in the operations compartment of the headquarters were really outstanding. They were excellent. I worked very, very well with them. Of course, I as has happened to me in the past, when I walked in to greet my new GOC, General Grobelaar, the first thing he said to me, well, one of the first things he said to me was, I've been contacted by General van Graan, who he was by then a general, and he's asked me to just inform you that you've been appointed as a Chief Range Officer for the Bisley, which is due to take place in a couple of months' time. So I knew I was back when that happened. So and I went, that was 1998. I went to the Bisley then, and since 1998 to this year, I haven't missed a single year. I've always been the Chief Range Officer at the Bisley since then. The command, Far North Command, was responsible for border protection, amongst other things, support to the police in general, but their primary activity at that stage tended to be border protection. And they had a border with Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. So, I had no intention of sitting in my office all the time. And I got out as much as I could and went to visit the various posts we had along the border and the deployments of the troops and accompanying the troops. I went on patrols with the troops, motorbike patrols. It was quite nice having going off on a scrambler and accompanying these patrols through along the border. It was an interesting time. The most active of those borders was the Zimbabwe border, particularly around Beitbridge, because there were people, increasing numbers of people. Now that South Africa is as a democratic government, the government hadn't totally opened our borders yet the way they've done now, but they were very, very much more lax about things, and so people were swarming in. There were lots of people coming in, and the troops had their hands full trying to control this influx of people, undocumented people coming across the border. And many of them came in at night. And I spent time up there at Beitbridge with the troops, seeing what what they faced with, and watching them catch people as they came across the border, particularly in the wintertime when the Limpopo River was dry, and they could just walk across. We had a sisal fence on the north at one stage, which had some success, but was not really a great success. The sisal was meant to form a barrier that people wouldn't be able to get across, but they figured out ways to get over. So the sisal fence had been replaced long ago by an electric fence. And that was a bit more difficult for them to cross, but they still figured out how to dig their way underneath it, how to place branches and trees on the fence and climb over, and how to cut holes in it despite the current flowing through it. And so it was a constant battle with the troops having to patrol all the time. And I found it very interesting to see what sort of tactics were used and how they were able to catch. And at that stage, we were still doing that. If a person came across who was undocumented, he was arrested, and then he was placed in a detention area, and then the Department of Home Affairs would examine his case, and usually they would be sent back. And I have one particular memory which really stuck with me. It was one night we were, I accompanied a group of guys down to the bridge, and they explained to me that these guys come across the bridge climbing on the girders underneath the bridge. And so they wait for them on the South African side. As they climb down off the girders, they grab them. And they watch them coming over. They had night vision equipment and so on. They could see the guys coming, and they would just catch them as they climbed off and deter them. And this guy was coming across, and he had a big coat on. It looked like a sort of an Air Force greatcoat that he had on. And he got to the end of the bridge and dropped down onto the ground. And as soon as he did so, the guys grabbed him. And they took him, and I followed them, and they took him up to detain him. And he was a young man. He was barely out of his teens. I don't know whether he was 17, 18 years old. All he had was a glass bottle, like a sort of a standard brandy bottle type of thing. Just a glass bottle with water in it. That's all he had. He had no money. He had no documentation. He had nothing. But you took one look at him and you could see this guy doesn't come from Zimbabwe. He comes from way further north. And when they questioned him, it emerged that he came from Somalia, from Somaliland. He'd come down all the way. And I spoke to him. His name was Mustafa. And Mustafa, both his parents were dead. The rest of his family had been killed. He was the only one who was left. There was no future for him there. His only hope was to get to South Africa and to try and build some sort of a future for himself. Because up there in the northeast and the Horn of Africa, and there was no hope for him there. And he'd come down through, through Ethiopia and Kenya and Tanzania and Malawi and Zambia and Zimbabwe. How he'd got there, I don't know. How he survived, what he ate, because he had nothing. He literally had nothing but a bottle of water. And now he'd been caught. And I never found out what happened to him. But he would have been handed over to Home Affairs, which was at that stage still largely in the hands of the old white guys who'd been there in previous years during the apartheid period. So, I don't know, but it really touched me to see this guy, that he traveled down the length of Africa and gets to the bridge, and the joy he must have felt in his heart when he dropped from that girder down to drop on the ground to think, I'm here, only to find that the guys are waiting to grab him. So this is part of the tragedy of Africa, and it was brought home to me in a stark way with young Mustafa that night. And I've often thought about him and wondered what happened to him. Where is he now? Is he still alive? Did he have to go all the way back to Somaliland? Did they deport him? Did they give him some sort of a chance? Who knows? And this is part of the problem that we're faced with in South Africa today, and it's a huge problem because there are hundreds, thousands of Mustafas hoping to survive, hoping to make a success of life. And we who are born into a privileged position have no concept of what people like that are faced with. Anyway, it was an interesting time that I had at Far North Command. I participated in planning in Pretoria for the restructuring of the SANDF. It had been decided that the 9 territorial commands would be disbanded. And they were army commands. And there was a move afoot, which was a perfectly sensible move. It was international, the way things are working internationally, to establish a joint headquarters, which would consist of all the arms of service. And this would be responsible for operations. And it was called joint operations. And with a lieutenant general at the head, same level of command as the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the medical service, or South African Health, Military Health Service. Each of these had a lieutenant general, and Joint Ops would have a lieutenant general as well. And each of the arms of service would train their people and then give them 2 Joint Ops to employ. And that was an international tendency. It still is. It's what happens in most countries. In most countries, there's a joint headquarters that employs the forces. And the respective arms of service prepare the forces, particularly where there are ongoing operations. Now, we'd had that situation before in South Africa. In the late 60s and early 70s, we had an organization known as Joint Combat Forces. And we had a GOC of Joint Combat Forces who was a lieutenant general. At that time, it was General Pop Fraser. And the Afrikaans abbreviation was BG Gesamentlike Gevechtsmagte. And it was the abbreviation was pronounced by most Afrikaans-speaking people as Bochum. So Bochum was the general officer commanding the Joint Combat Forces. And I thought at that time, I thought of myself, it was a very sensible situation. But then we went back to having separate Army, Air Force, and Navy. And in fact, a lot of the command and control difficulties that we experienced during our war was precisely because of that, because you could not have an Army headquarters with an Air Force element under operational command. It would be placed under operational control. Now, in the command and control, the command affiliations, that's a different affiliation altogether. And when you have someone under control but not under command, you can't really tell them what to do. You tell them what you expect them to do, and they will work it all out. And there were distinct problems with that. The Rhodesians, with their combined operations, or ComOps as they called it, with Peter Walls at the head, theirs was more like the modern situation that you have. And I personally think that the Rhodesian system worked better than what our system did. But anyway, we were now moving towards that in the new SANDF. And this is what we were going to do. So instead of having army commands, the army would retain its logistic support and so on, which had fallen under the commands, and there would be regional or territorial areas that would have that responsibility, but the army would no longer have an operational responsibility. And instead of the 9 territorial commands, it was decided that there would be 5 joint headquarters. 1 in the north, 1 in the south, 1 in the east, 1 in the west, and 1 in the middle. And these were called regional joint task forces. So they had a different role to the old army command. The army command had command over everything army in their particular area. And the army commands were coincidentally almost identical to the provinces that were the new provinces that came into being under the ANC government. It was as if they'd looked at the army commands, territorial commands, and taken those to be the provinces. It was very, very similar. And so now you had the situation where the commands are going to be disbanded, and they'll be replaced by these 5 territorial commands. There was RJTF South in Port Elizabeth, RJTF North in Petersburg, RJTF East in Durban, and RJTF West in Cape Town. And then you had RJTF Central in Gauteng. And, you know, the provinces were all divided up for these guys to take responsibility. The commanders of each of these. And each of these, the commands were already all run by major generals. But each of these RJTFs would now become, so instead of having 9 major generals at the army commands, you would have 5 major generals at the joint headquarters. And they didn't have to be army. They could be Air Force. They could be a rear admiral from the Navy. So they were completely joint headquarters. But all this had to be worked out. How was it going to work? And I was privileged to be one of those who was sent down to Pretoria to participate in the planning for this, how it was going to work. And I think we worked out a pretty good way of doing it. There were more of the former MK and the Homeland Army elements that came together for that sort of planning. And then, you know, when weekends would come and when I'd go back up to Petersburg to my job there, it would be back to it was like that old army command was as if there'd been no democratic election, nothing had changed. It was just the way it always had been. Of course, it was very efficient, and that was run by very professional people. But it was certainly not the face of the new South Africa. And then in 1998. That first year of mine at Petersburg, I was called in by the GOC in the second half of the year and told that there's a huge problem down in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Midlands, and at a place called Richmond, which is south of Pietermaritzburg. At Richmond, there was extreme violence. There was a lot of violence in KwaZulu-Natal. It was no less violent in those days than what it is now. In fact, in those days, it may even have been worse. One must remember that KZN was one of the only 2 provinces that wasn't governed by the ANC. It was governed by the IFP. And the IFP and the ANC had been at war before the elections. And according to some sources, the ANC actually conceded KZN to the IFP in an effort to get the violence to subside. But then there was the UDM came into being, Bantu Holamisa's organization. And they were also trying to make inroads in KwaZulu-Natal. And very soon there was a virtual war between the UDM and the ANC. And it was focused around Richmond. And the government was so concerned about it. And I don't understand why there was an army command in Durban, and that army command was responsible for helping the police to maintain order over there, anywhere in KwaZulu-Natal. But on a political level, it was decided that this can't be left to the army command. There must be a special Richmond task force, or task group. The Richmond task group would have a specific responsibility for sorting this out. And it would not be underneath the army command there. It would report directly to what was called the NatJOC, the National Joint Operations Center, which had someone from Joint Operations. In fact, chairing the NatJOC was the Chief of Joint Operations. At that stage, it was Lieutenant General Dion Ferreira. And then the Deputy Commissioner of Police, who at that stage was Commissioner Andre Preuss. And the two of them were the co-chairs of the National JOC. And this Richmond task force would report directly to them. Of course, that didn't impress the GOC of Natal Command because it was in his area. And so I was informed that by Van Grobbelaar that I was being appointed the commander of the Richmond Task Group. And I would have to go down to Richmond in KwaZulu-Natal and assist the police in a form a joint headquarters there, and assist the police in quelling the unrest, the factional war that was going on in that area. Now, Richmond was a very rural area. Rolling hills, magnificent forests and plantations on the hills, farms all over the place, quiet, beautiful area. But Richmond itself, the little town of Richmond, had 3 large and separate townships just outside the town, what were in the old days referred to as locations. And each of these locations held a faction. One was an ANC location, the other was a UDM location, and the third was an IFP location. Now, when I got there, I had to now find out what was going on. And I found out that the IFP township was very quiet. There didn't seem to be any sort of problem with the IFP township. But the ANC township and the UDM township, they were at one another's throats. During that year, 1998, there were between 250 and 300 deaths in KwaZulu-Natal in the political violence that was taking place. And a third of them were in the Richmond area. So we're talking around about 100 people who've been killed in political violence in Richmond, and this is where they sent me to. Some political commentators and analysts claim that the actual number of deaths was far higher than 300, far higher. They put it at more than double that. But be that as it may, the fact is that there were a lot of people being murdered with political motives. And the Richmond area was with the sort of hotspot where all of this was taking place. At least a dozen politicians from those 3 parties, the ANC, the IFP, and the UDM, at least a dozen were assassinated in KwaZulu-Natal in 1998. All right, so the problems in Richmond were being fomented by a warlord who lived there. He was a UDM man, and his name was Sifiso Nkabinde. And Sifiso Nkabinde was a very, very cunning man. He couldn't be nailed down for anything. But everybody believed that he was responsible for everything. But nobody could nail him down. And I spoke to him quite often. After I'd left Richmond the following year, not many months after I'd left, he was murdered. He was assassinated. But he was a very influential person in that part of KwaZulu-Natal. And when I'd speak to him, I knew that he knew exactly what was going on and who was responsible. And when there'd been another murder and been more violence in the area, and I went to speak to him, butter would melt in his mouth. He knew nothing about these things. But I knew, and he knew that I knew that he knew exactly what was going on. But when you're dealing with a warlord, you're a stranger in the area, and he's in his home territory, and he knows exactly what is going on. So it was a very difficult situation. I had a headquarters just outside of Richmond. Some sort of agricultural hall or something was made available to us, and we set up a headquarters there. And I had a base camp with my troops in a forested area in the mountains just around Richmond. It was a magnificent area to work in, but it was a very unpleasant task. We had to try and get to know the people in the townships, but they were all intimidated. They were part of factions. There were family feuds that went back generations. We were outsiders, and we had no concept of what was really going on there. All we could do was, by our presence, try to keep a lid on this boiling pot that existed there. But we weren't party to what was going on underground. So it was a very difficult situation. I had an unusual force at my disposal, and they were actually well suited for the task. I had conventional infantry, companies of conventional infantry, but I also had dogs and horses and motorbikes. So the unit that, I don't know whether they'd become known as 9SAI yet at that stage, I can't remember, but they were based in Potchefstroom, and they were the old mounted center. The motorbikes, the horses, and the dogs were all lumped together in this one unit as a specialist infantry unit. And I had them at my disposal, and they were very good. So we had, in our base camp, we had temporary kennels set up, we had temporary stables set up, we had a light workshop troop for the motorbikes set up. In the mornings we'd have a parade, and we'd have to do first parade on the motorbikes and and on the horses and the dogs, and they'd all come onto parade and have to be checked and so on. And I had some excellent officers amongst them, and some very good NCOs, a couple of sergeants major who understood how the motorbikes were, because I didn't have the technical knowledge for these sort of things. I didn't know enough about. I steered clear of horses. My experience with horses at the military academy had been enough for me. I had no desire to go around on horses. But those things were excellent. The horses at night in the townships for patrols They were excellent. People didn't see them coming. It was very difficult for people to have arrange a rally, a political rally, because these guys would, before they knew it, they'd be surrounded by a lot of mounted troops. The guys couldn't hide from the dogs. They would sniff things out when they were looking for weapons or explosives and things like that. There were narrow little alleys between the shacks in the townships, and the horses managed to move through those quite easily. If I had to get troops somewhere in a hurry, the motorbikes were ideal. Those guys just loved roaring off on the motorbikes and so on. But I saw very clearly in that unit, I could see that the actual transformation was busy taking place, because there was no longer national service, and most of the troops were black troops, which was useful because many of them spoke Zulu or Xhosa, and as a result they could communicate with the people in the townships. But it was also problematic because many of the troops had their own political affiliations. And it was difficult to ensure neutrality amongst your troops. They could have family there. You don't know, and you can't expect them to act against their family. So it's always the horror of employing your troops internally against your own people. It's just not what should happen. It's not what the military should do. But it was the task we were given, and that's what we had to do. I usually had at least one helicopter at my disposal. Usually a small helicopter, an Alouette, which were being phased out already at that stage, but we still had Alouettes or the BK helicopters. And which we'd taken over from the homelands, the Transkei and Potchefstroom had used BKs, and so they were now in the Air Force. And sometimes I had more, sometimes I had several helicopters. Occasionally I'd have we still had a few Pumas flying at that stage, and we had some of the new Oryxes. But I wouldn't often have them. It was mainly the smaller helicopters. So I used them more for reconnaissance and for command and control, not so much for actual trooping, although we did do some smaller trooping in the area. It was very interesting stuff, because in amongst the political shenanigans, there was also the local white farmers in the area who had cattle would experience cattle rustling, and their cattle would disappear, and they'd come looking for cattle, and then we'd be, our police would have to go and do an investigation, and then we'd be asked to help to try and catch the rustlers and so on. So in between the politics, there was the cattle rustling aspect that had to be looked at as well. Because it was such a hot spot in South Africa at the time, we had several high-profile visits, the chief of the army and the chief of the SANDF. We'd had this nasty sort of setup with when General Meyering was he resigned because his position had become untenable. They were really fine looking for excuses to force him out. General Nyanda was now the chief of the SANDF. General Romano was the chief of the army, and they both came down and did try to take them on tours through the Richmond townships and explain to them what was going on and so on. But knowing that they're ANC people, they obviously support the one faction. So how do you really play a neutral role, a peacekeeping role in a situation like that, where your senior officers are actually part of one of the factions that are carrying out the violence in the area? So, it wasn't a satisfying sort of job for any soldier. Once again, as was the case in Alexandra, I'm busy impersonating policemen and placating politicians instead of soldiering. The only difference was that now it's in a rural area. In Alexandra, it was in an urban area. I had to attend some meetings of the provincial council in Pietermaritzburg. That was when I didn't meet him, but I saw our future President Zuma a few times because he was involved in the legislature. I don't know quite what role he was playing because it wasn't an ANC-run province at that stage. But I just tried to steer clear of the politics, and I had a difficult situation in that logistically, the only place we could be supported logistically was by the Natal Command. And the Natal Command was not happy about us being there because it's their territory. And it's like a vote of no confidence in them to take this little island out of Natal Command and say, we're having a separate a task group here that must report to the National JOC. And you Natal Command, it's got nothing to do with you. You don't get any of the sit reps. Everything goes up to the Nat JOC. But you've got to support it. You've got to provide them with vehicles and fuel and rations and all the other stuff. It's got to come from you. So it was a difficult situation. Fortunately or unfortunately, one of my former senior paratrooper commanders was the OC at Natal Command, Major General Chris Leroux. And I knew him very well. So, I had no problem going in to speak to him about anything. But I could see and I could sense that he objected to what was going on. He didn't hold me responsible. I mean, I'd just been given the job. But he didn't think it was a good idea. He felt he could do that job himself. He's got a group commander who's based in Pietermaritzburg, and this area falls under that group commander. And the group commander, I think it was Fred Wilkie at that stage, was a highly competent special forces operator who'd been promoted out of the special forces as a full colonel and was a group commander there. And, I have no doubt that Fred Wilkie could have done the job perfectly well. Fred was not, Fred tended to, he almost treated me as if it was my fault, as if I was imposing on and interfering in what he was doing. So he wasn't very friendly towards me, but it didn't bother me too much. Chris Leroux was a former paratrooper colleague, a comrade of mine. So I didn't have any, and of course the SSO ops at Natal Command was Jan Hoogaard from 32 Battalion. And Jan I knew well, and I had a good relationship with him. So, and I went through I didn't deal with Fred. If I needed anything, logistic support and so on, I went through to the Natal Command in Durban. And I used to attend their monthly command meeting, so that, I think Crystal Leroux would have objected if I didn't. And in any case, it was a matter of courtesy from my part as to do that, because I was in his area. But it was, from a command and control point of view, it was a ridiculous setup, but it had to be done. And while I was there, I heard about the Lesotho incursion, Operation Bolias, taking place. So, I heard that there were paratroopers that were killed. I heard that there was, there was a lot of fighting that took place. And afterwards, I interviewed some of those people when I was doing some of my research and got a better idea of what took place. Did some research, got some of the documents and reports on it, and because there were a lot of reports that were given to Parliament about what took place there. But it was a bit disconcerting to hear that this was going on. Anyway, that was the Richmond Task Group. It was a little interlude in my career. It was a very interesting experience. I can't remember how long I spent there. I think it was 3 months, might have been a bit longer. I don't know. But it was a good experience. It was a positive experience for me, but it was not a pleasant one at all. But being deployed against your own people inside South Africa has never been a pleasant task for me. After I returned to Petersburg, I got a phone call from General Nyanda, the new chief of the SANDF, and he asked me to become his personal staff officer. Now, I didn't know the man well. I'd seen him. I mean, I'd spent a week with him in Taiwan when he came with his wife on an official visit, and during that week, I moved around everywhere with him, and I got to know him reasonably well. But I mean, I couldn't really say I knew the man that well. But he asked me if I would become his PSO. His previous PSO had been a fellow by the name of Craig Harrison, who was a very good friend of mine. He'd been one of my classmates at the military academy. But Craig he and General Nyanda got on very well together. But Craig had resigned and left the military, and he later went on to have a very distinguished career in intelligence and security with the United Nations. But he decided to leave the Defense Force. And Nyanda was looking for a new PSO. So he knew me from his visit to Taiwan. And I'd dealt with him again when he'd visited us in Richmond. And I'd had to take him around and show him what we were doing over there. So he now wanted me to become his PSO. I turned it down. I felt good reason for doing so. The reason that I gave him was one of the reasons. I said to him, my wife is suffering from depression as a result of what happened to us in Taiwan. She's under treatment at the moment. If I became your PSO, I would have to accompany you all over the place, and I'd very rarely be at home. And I don't think that would be conducive to my wife's recovery from the depression that she's going through at the moment. I really don't think that I could manage it. And he accepted that. And but you know, there were other reasons too. I was a little sour at that stage with the chief of Army Staff personnel, who's the guy who looks at the promotions and so on. I'd been to see him after I got back from Taiwan, and in fact, before I got back from Taiwan, when I was back, I can't remember what it was. Perhaps when I came back for Anne's father's funeral. But in any case, I made an appointment, went to see the Chief of Army Staff Personnel, who at that stage was Major General Dippenaar, who former OC of 61 MEC and of the Army Battle School, who'd been military attaché in Israel, and he'd also formed the so-called Rapid Deployment Force. And he and I had issues about what rapid deployment was and so on. But it was a man I had a lot of respect for, a very professional officer. But I went to see him and I said to him, "Sir, I'd like to have some idea what sort of career prospects I've got. Is it worth my while to continue in the military or do I need to look elsewhere?" And so he pulled out the promotions list and so on and went through that. And he said to me, "Well, I can tell you in all honesty now, looking at this lot, you will come in line for consideration, because we have to promote the black guys now, and you will come into line for promotion to brigadier, probably about 16 years after you retire. So essentially, he was saying to me, "You're not going anywhere. You've reached the end of your road." So I wasn't going to take a job as Nyanda's PSO and be a colonel for the rest of my career I didn't really have ambitions to go further, but I would like to have some decent postings. And I didn't regard personal staff officer to the Chief of the National Defence Force as a great posting. I mean, for some people that's wonderful. They enjoy that sort of thing. I wouldn't have enjoyed it. You're the general's dog's body. You got to run around and do his bidding for all sorts of things and make sure that everything is right for him. I really, it didn't appeal in the least to me. I don't think I have the temperament and the makeup for that sort of job. So I managed to get out of that one. I finished my honours degree. It was I worked on it did it over 2 years. I did it my last year in Taiwan. I came back from Taiwan. I had to write exams a few weeks, I think about a week or two after I got back. I can't remember, but I had to write. We were still staying in a hotel. We hadn't even got a house in Petersburg yet, and I had to write exams. And then the end of my second year, I did my final exams, and I passed. And the tasks that I submitted and so on, I got very positive feedback from the lecturers, and they expressed the hope. Or one of the lecturers said, "We really hope that I did a task on Feel, one of the settler historians." And the lecturer who marked my paper wrote back and said, "This is the best paper I've ever read on Feel, and I really hope that you're going to, when you finished your masters, you're going to your honors, that you're going to do your masters and your honors from this university as well." So that actually happened after many more years, but it was encouraging, that sort of thing. So I'd selected the modules. You had a vast selection of modules you could do for a history honors degree at UNISA, and I'd very carefully selected my modules to cover Africa, and specifically Southern Africa. I had to do some European stuff, but I focused mainly on Africa and Southern Africa, and more recent periods in that history, because I really wanted to better contextualize the further postgraduate research that I wanted to do, because I knew I wanted to go into doing the airborne aspects of South Africa. But I needed to contextualize them properly. So I selected those modules very carefully, and I think it was very beneficial for me. It helped me to understand and place into context a lot of the things that happened that I wrote about in my master's and my PhD. At that stage, when the graduation came, I couldn't attend the graduation because I was deployed somewhere. I can't remember what it was, but I couldn't get to the graduation. But I didn't regard that as important. It was important for me to be there for my first degree. But graduation ceremony is hardly a great pleasure to attend. But so it's actually very boring. So I got my degree in abstentia. I was very pleased to get it. It didn't make any real difference to anyone else, but it did give me a better backing and a better background to tackle further research. we had a policy that was in existence at that stage, and it was a strange policy. It was you had to apply for your posts, and they advertised a whole lot of posts. So these posts are all available. So I looked at the posts and I thought, well, I'm going to apply. And a lot of the posts were, well, not a lot, but quite a few were for Brigadier General. At that stage, they'd now changed the name of Brigadier, the rank of Brigadier, and it had become Brigadier General. And, people have mixed feelings about that, but the fact of the matter is that Brigadier General was always the rank. Through it had developed historically as the rank for a person who was commanding a brigade. He was a Brigadier General. Any command post above a unit was given to a general, and the lowest general's rank was Brigadier General. So we'd always had Brigadier Generals. Throughout the First World War, we didn't have brigadiers, we had Brigadier Generals. But there's a story, I think it's an apocryphal story, but Professor Dion Fourie, who was also a brigadier and became a Brigadier General from UNISA, he assured me that the story is true. At the end of the First World War, the British Army had grown so big during the First World War that the British Parliament complained that there are too many generals in the army. The army's got to downscale and get rid of. They've got too many generals. So apparently, the way the army overcame this was they decided, well, we can't just fire people. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the rank of Brigadier General and just call it Brigadier. Then they're not generals anymore. And then they could go back to Parliament and say, we used to have, 800 generals, but now we've only got 400. And Parliament said, yes, that's where we like to see that. That's good. And all they'd done was change Brigadier General to, Brigadier General down to Brigadier. And he was no longer regarded as a general. And all the Commonwealth countries did the same. They changed their rank from Brigadier General to Brigadier. Those who were retired were allowed to retain their rank of Brigadier General, but everyone else became brigadiers. And the Brits were the only ones who had brigadiers. The Americans had Brigadier Generals, the French had Brigadier Generals, everybody had Brigadier Generals. But now the Brits have done away with it, to again placating the politicians. Anyway, so now we're back on Brigadier Generals, and a lot of Brigadier General posts are being offered or being made available. Now you can apply for these. So I selected as many as I could that I felt this is a sort of job I would like. The first choice I made was to become GOC of Special Forces. My second choice was to become the commandant of the Army Battle School. My third choice was to become the commandant or supervisor, I'm not sure what they call him, I think the commandant of the Military Academy. And then there were two brigade headquarters that had been established, 4-3 and 4-4, 4-2 and 4-3 brigade. And these brigade headquarters were Brigadier General's posts. So I applied for both of those. And then the next was each of the regional joint task forces had a chief of staff. They were all going to be major general's posts, but they had a chief of staff who was a major general, at least a brigadier general. So I applied for all the posts. I think I applied for 3. I applied for West in Cape Town to be the chief of staff there. for East in Durban to be the Chief of Staff there, and for South in Port Elizabeth to be the Chief of Staff there. And then I applied for several colonel's posts, mainly as group commanders. But I didn't really want to go and get any of those posts because I knew that they were going to close the groups one of these days. They would disappear because I knew the commandos were going to disappear too. They hadn't publicly said so, but it was obvious that was going to happen. And when the commandos closed, the groups would have to close. When the promotions came out and the list came out, to my surprise, I was promoted. I was promoted to Brigadier General. And I was given choice number 8 on the list that, according to my preferences, the 8th choice that I made was as Chief of Staff of Regional Joint Task Force South in Port Elizabeth. And that's the one I got. I wasn't unhappy about that, but I would have preferred a command appointment. I was hoping to get a command appointment. But there were other guys who got those appointments, and I'm very glad for that. It's nice that they got them. I was just glad that I got a promotion. It would hopefully it would give me it would certainly give me an increase in salary. Hopefully, it would improve my pension one day. I don't think it actually did. I think that a senior colonel ended up with a better pension than a brigadier general. But one of the big advantages was that I qualified for an official subsidized motor car, and it enabled me to sell my Mercedes-Benz that I'd bought in 16 years earlier in Spain. And the subsidy that I got with the balance from the car that I now sold, I was able to acquire for my first 4x4 double cab bakkie, which was wonderful, and I used that extensively. So midway through 1999, I didn't have to wait until 16 years after I'd retired. I got my promotion. General Dippenaar was not there anymore, so I don't know what role he played or didn't play. He'd left the military. But I do know that General Van Grobbelaar put in a very good word for me, and I'm very grateful for that. So there we are. Then I entered into a new era in my military career. I was sent with my new GOC, who was an Opla man. I was sent to Cape Town to attend an affirmative action course, which was run by U.S. Armed Forces officers. That was a bit of a farce to me. It was actually a load of nonsense, and those guys didn't know anything about South Africa. They pretended to, but they really didn't. And they were talking about things the way they did it in America, and we had a very different situation in South Africa. But anyway, I got my certificate for attending the course. I questioned a lot of the things on the course that they said, and they didn't like some of the things that I said, particularly when they were talking about stereotyping people. And, they couldn't answer some of the questions that I asked them. The statement that this Black American Air Force colonel who was running the course made was, he said, stereotyping in any form is negative. You must never stereotype people. It's always negative. So I said to him, Colonel, how would you regard it if people told you that the colored community in South Africa have an extremely sharp and very dry sense of humor? I said, why would that be negative? I think that's a very positive characteristic. Isn't that stereotyping? And he danced around with that. He said, well, you know, it's probably could be described as a characteristic rather than actual stereotyping. And I thought to myself, you know, you're talking nonsense now. What you told us was stereotyping earlier on was anything any form of behavior that you attach to a group is negative. But I've just told you about a very positive form of behavior, and now you want to tell me that because it's positive, it can't be stereotyping. And then I said to him, you know, one of the things that I find most appealing about South Africa is the way that the black people in South Africa, when they are singing their own songs, the way in which they can harmonize. They harmonize without even practicing it. They don't even have to go and do rehearsals. When they get together and they sing, they just have this amazing ability to harmonize. But that's stereotyping, and that's positive. So what are you telling me? He didn't have answers for that sort of thing, and in fact he became a little offended with me and felt that I was trying to sabotage his course. So, you know, when it comes to the so-called affirmative action course run by Americans for South Africans, I don't know. I mean, they're talking about a minority over there. We're talking about a majority over here. There's a difference. And this is the only country where affirmative action is required to place the majority, to advantage the majority of people in a democratic country. So, you know, anyway, that's, I don't want to get involved in the politics of that. So now I find myself in Port Elizabeth, in a joint headquarters with Army, Air Force, Naval, military health, staff officers in their headquarters. And this headquarters is now going to be put together as a permanent entity that will be able to function and run any operations that are going to be run in the Eastern Cape. The whole of the Eastern Cape was our area of responsibility, which is one of the bigger provinces. So it was quite a big area. Some of the other regional joint task forces had more than one province that was their responsibility. But the provinces weren't all as big as the one that we had. We had the former Transkei and the former Eastern Cape or Eastern Province area was our responsibility. And I was pleased to be in the Eastern Cape because, you know, my 1820 settlers landed in Algoa Bay and helped to develop the infrastructure of the Eastern Cape and played a prominent role in promoting farming, wagon building, road building, various other things that they played a key role in the Eastern Cape. So it was an area which I didn't know well, but which I always felt an affinity to, and I was very pleased to be able to now be living here. My GOC, who was, as I say, a former Upla man, I got on very well with him. He was a cultured man. He was a very reasonable man. He was very courteous, very intelligent. You could discuss all sorts of things with him. He had a great love of classical music. He was in many ways a gentleman, not the sort of man you would expect to be in a radical organization like the PAC. So it was quite a revelation for me. But despite all his positive aspects, he didn't know very much about military matters. And he left the running of the task force almost entirely in my hands. I didn't object to that. In fact, I really relished it. I loved it. but he was, when he realized that, this was where my interest lay. I didn't have political connections. I didn't have right-wing motives and underhand currents or anything that I was, and he felt confident in me. He allowed me to continue, and I did, and I appreciated that. So I was able to, because we were getting something off the ground where there was nothing before. We were using the same headquarters that the old command headquarters had been in. The command was still in the process of closing down, and they had to move out and go through their closure program, and many of them had taken severance packages and were leaving. Brigadier General Jock Harris, who had been one of my instructors at the infantry school, he was the chief of staff at the command, and he was left with a job of closing down the headquarters and getting. He then left the military as well, and so I had to build up something from scratch, which was a nice challenge to be faced with. I introduced a proper management system. I insisted that we have an annual command appreciation and an annual planning cycle. And I discussed all these things with the GOC. The GOC wouldn't make a command appreciation, so I had to make it. And he just signed it. When the command briefing was done, he wasn't prepared to do it, so I did the command briefing. And I would take the people away for a week to some place. We would make use of a conference facility, and I usually made it in an isolated area, the Katberg or Port St. John's, or somewhere far away from everyone and everything, where we had no distractions, and we'd sit down there and work through a complete planning cycle to decide how we're going to make things work this week, or at least the year that lies ahead. I also introduced an annual reconnaissance, where I would take the staff of the task force on a trip in vehicles, 4x4 vehicles, and we'd go out to outlying areas or to hotspots in our area of responsibility, because I very quickly discovered that most of the people, the only thing they knew about the Eastern Cape was Port Elizabeth, and maybe if they came from East London, and a handful of them had served in Grahamstown, but they didn't know anything else about it. They didn't really know. They hadn't served, they hadn't been based, they hadn't lived in any of the other places, and they may have driven through them, but they didn't really know anything about them. So I arranged for briefings, and then we went to these places, and we camped out, and we showed them some of the sites and introduced them to some of the people in the area. And I got some of the staff officers. I had two really good people who were my SSO reserve force, who was a part-time soldier, Colonel Don Wilkins. He'd been OC of two different commando units. He was involved in personnel on the railways. He had grown up in the Transkei, where his father had a trading store. He spoke Xhosa absolutely fluently, and he knew the Eastern Cape like the back of his hand. So to have someone like that on your staff was marvelous. We could go anywhere, and he could speak to anyone. He could get, next to no time, he would have people that would be able to brief us on things and tell us what was going on and introduce us to some of the communities. It was a wonderful way of getting to know the area. It was an education for me as well as for the other staff officers. And I made that an important part of our life in the task force headquarters. And I introduced a daily routine, which if I hadn't done, it was clear to me that nothing would have been done about it. And I really wanted a proper operational routine in the headquarters. So I would come in early in the mornings and meet with a task force sergeant major and have a one-on-one meeting with him. Not for long, 10, 15 minutes maybe, every day. And because this is what I used to do with my sergeant major when I was a brigade sergeant major, just to be able to know what is going on at the NCO and troop level. He was the person who was the go-between, and he was the person who could brief me and give me a good idea of what was happening. Then I'd go through to the ops room, and I insisted that all the staff came into the ops room every day for an intelligence and an ops briefing from the intelligence and the ops staff. They had to know what had happened in our area of responsibility during the past 24 hours and what we saw was likely to happen in the next 24 hours, what we anticipated might happen in the next 24 hours. So the ops and the in staff had to prepare a little briefing. It was always relatively short, maximum of 20 minutes. Often it was less than that, because you wouldn't have to repeat everything the same every day. If things were unchanged, they were unchanged. But any other developments, anything that was happening, so that the work that they were doing could be related to what our task was. Otherwise, people get involved in the paperwork that they're doing, and they've got no idea why they're doing it. So I insisted that we have that every day. And then the OC never attended. The GOC, the general, he never attended. But when we'd finished that meeting or that briefing, I'd go through to his office, and then I'd brief him just for 10 minutes, give him some of the salient points and tell him what was happening, and that's fine. And then we wouldn't see him again for the rest of the day. He'd sit in his office, listen to classical music or whatever else tickled his fancy, go off to meetings with the police commissioner or whatever else, and we carried on running the task force headquarters. And then after I'd briefed him, I went to my office where I had a big conference table, and all the senior staff officers would sit around that table, so that I'd have the personnel, the intelligence, the ops, the logistics, the finance, all of them would be sitting around the table. And I'd go through a discussion with each one of them, and issue orders with them, tell them what was required. At a later stage, the GOC began to say, well, he'd better have a meeting in his office first before I spoke to the staff. And we did that then. We'd go into his office and we'd sit down there, and then we'd have a meeting, but there were hardly any ever decisions that were taken then. So afterwards, I'd get all the staff together in my office, and I'd say, right, now, personnel, this is what I want you to do. Intelligence, this is what I want you to do. Ops, this is what I want you to do. And we'd go around and I'd make sure everybody knew what they were doing, and then off they'd go to their various offices and ops rooms and so on, and they'd do their work for the day. And then I would spend the rest of the day either visiting the staff offices wherever they are, or doing planning in my office and coordinating administration and people coming to see me to sort out various problems and so on. What our task was, we had this mountainous border with Lesotho. Stock theft was rife, with the Basutus coming over the border and stealing from the farmers on our side of the border. We had to patrol the border, and for that we had troops that were placed under our command, and we would deploy them all along the border. We found that, and our troops at that stage were already almost all black. We very rarely had any white troops at all. And interestingly, the commandos, because the commandos still existed at that stage, and the commandos were almost all, their soldiers were almost all black at that stage. There were no longer, there were very few whites in the commandos. But these black troops, often they were guys who didn't have work. And they'd be trained now as commandos. They'd be called up and do, 6 weeks of sort of basic training and several sessions that they would come up. And when they'd been taught the basics, then we would deploy them in companies. And we found that the commando troops that we deployed were far more effective than the regular force troops that we deployed. And the reason was very simple. If they didn't do their job properly, then you just had to say to them, I won't call you up again this year. And because they didn't have a job, that meant no income. They wanted to be called up as much as you could call them up, because they didn't have any work. So they were, with this threat hanging over their heads that they might not be called up if they don't do their job properly, they did a fine job. And the farmers on the border were very clear that the farmers on the border would get very upset if they heard that they were getting regular troops, because the regular troops were plain straightforward. They were slapgat. That's what they were. They just didn't do their work because they knew they couldn't be fired. They knew it didn't matter whether they did the work or not. So they wouldn't go on patrol. They wouldn't chase after the poachers when the guys came over and stole the sheep. So that was an interesting one, and it's all in the mountains. I mean, it's the southern Drakensberg. It's high mountains. It's really rough terrain there to operate in. And the guy, we had little containers that we had taken up there and placed in position. The troops slept in the containers, and they had to patrol at night and patrol at day by day. And we had helicopters to support them and to resupply them and so on. So it was interesting operations that we were doing with them. We also had this long coastline, and we had to work the coastal border because of the poaching that was going on there, particularly parliament poaching and stripping of other resources. And we did this in conjunction with the Navy and with Special Forces. Special Forces helped us a great deal with that. And, we'd have these elements would be attached to us, Air Force, Navy, Special Forces, whatever, all with the medical support. And we had the staff that came from those organizations that would help us to coordinate things. And it worked very well. I thought it was a good system that we had going. It worked very well. We also found ourselves mediating and keeping the peace during faction fighting in the former Transkei. Yeah, that place was volatile. Nobody wanted to call it the Transkei anymore. It was not regarded as politically correct to do so. I mean, it was across the Kai River, and that's the only reason it was called Transkei, but it wasn't PC to refer to the... So you spoke about the eastern half of the of the Eastern Cape. But we would find that the faction fighting there, especially over Easter and Christmas, because that's when the migrant workers who were working up in the Witwatersrand would come back. And that's where they would discover that their wives have been cheating on them, or their neighbors been stealing their cattle, and so you'd have all sorts of issues cropping up at that time. And we had to have the people around there. And I remember we had this one captain who was a former Transkei officer. And he was very good, this guy. He was a very, very professional officer, but he was a bit radical, because I'd say to him, man, these guys are stealing the cattle and so on. It's such a job to get them sorted out. He said, well, I said to him, how did you guys manage this when in the old Transkei, in the Transkei Defence Force? So he looked at me with quite a puzzled expression in his face. He said, General, it was never a problem for us. I said, why wasn't it a problem? He said, if they stole cattle and they went into one of these forests, then we'd mortar them in the forest. I said to him, well, we can't do that. And he says, yeah, but it worked. Anyway, we had this, we had these issues. And we also found ourselves mediating in labor disputes. I mean, you couldn't get less military than that, but these are the sort of things we found ourselves in. these big tea estates that people were trying to establish in the Transkei, because apparently it's a good area for tea. And there'd been vast tea estates that had been established there. But they never got off the ground properly because there were always labor disputes. And the chief of this area would say, all right, you're planting this tea estate in my tribal land. So you must only hire people from my community. Nobody else works here except people from my community. But then they don't want to do the work properly. But the people from across the valley, they're dying to do some work. So the owner of the tea estate gives them the job. So there's a riot. So, you know, and then we've got to come in and try and sort this nonsense out. So there were numerous little issues like that we were faced with. I found myself paying numerous visits to commando units, to citizen force units, attending their parades. They'd, invite you to parades. There would be formal mess evenings. There would be all sorts of other functions. And some of those units I really established very close relationships with, particularly, for instance, the first city in Grahamstown. The Buffalo Volunteer Rifles, which had previously been known as the Kaffrarian Rifles, but that term was regarded as offensive, so they had to change it. Fortunately, they had before they became the Kaffrarian Rifles, they had been known as the Buffalo Volunteer Rifles, so they went back to the original name. So nobody was offended when they changed, and nobody felt done in by it. And besides those two citizen force units, which were very traditional units, and had a lot of very traditional customs and uniforms and so on, and I enjoyed working with them very much. The Amatola commander, I established a very good relationship with the commander there, and he would always invite me to these units' functions and parades and things like that. So. And then, of course, I had Don Wilkins, the SSO Ops, and his Sergeant Major, Warrant Officer Brian Reese. Man, they were good, those guys. And I could send them all over the place, and they would sort out problems for me. And they did. Don was retired, and he had the time on his hands. So whenever I needed him to do anything, he happily did it for me. So I made sure they both had a vehicle that they could travel in and that they could carry out those tasks for me. I was also invited to speak at a lot of meetings and dinners, often for non-military, like the Port Elizabeth Scottish Association or the Moths and the SA Legion, none of which had anything to do with the military as such. I mean, mostly the military people in them, but they would invite me to give talks like that. And then I survived a little crisis one day. We were having a visit by the Chief of Joint Operations, and he brought his deputy down. It was General Dion Ferreira was the Chief of Joint Operations. His deputy was General Godfrey Ngwenya, who would later take over as Chief of Joint Ops and eventually as Chief of the Defence Force. And then, of course, there was my GOC, who was a Major General, and there was a Major General Andre Bespier, who was an old former paratrooper that I knew very well. They were all part of the delegation, and we had to now take them and show them what we were doing in our area. This was I think in the first 6 months after the task force had been established in 1999, towards the end of the year. And there was this a particular part of the Drakensberg where we'd been having a lot of problems with the Basutos coming over and stealing livestock from the farmers. And so we took them up there to show them the place by helicopter. And we had 2 helicopters. We had an Oryx and we had a BK. And we broke all the regulations and when we loaded these aircraft, because we had the chief of joint operations, his deputy, my GOC, and me. We were all in one helicopter, because the GOC said, no, you got to come with, because you know what's going on here. You must tell the guys what is happening. And General Ferreira said to his deputy, Godfrey, you've got to know everything that's going on, so you must go with me. And General Bestbeard was in the Oryx with a number of the other staff officers. And I had my ash cane that I always carried with me in between my legs as I was sitting in and I had General Ferreira on the one side of me and my GOC on the other side. And we took off from Umtata. I refueled at Umtata. And I don't know exactly what went wrong. I think that when the pilots refueled, they didn't take into full account how heavily loaded the helicopter would be. And so we went up, and there was this container with a section of troops in it. And we were going to land next to this container and show the guys, the conditions that the troops live in and where they have to patrol and so on. And this container was right up where the KZN border and the Eastern Cape border meet on the Lesotho border. And that's more or less where this container was. And it was on the edge of a drop that just dropped away for hundreds of meters down on one side, and then a more gentle slope on the other side into Lesotho. And there was a road not too far, a little dirt track really, that they could be replenished by, and it sort of wandered in and out of Lesotho, to get there. But you could only get there with a really good 4x4 vehicle. And we came down to land, and we could see the container in front of us and the steep drop on our right, and this more gentle slope over on our left. And we came down, and as the helicopter was coming to settle, it started to turn. And I looked, and I saw the pilot and the co-pilot were busy frantically trying to do something, and it turned. And it turned right around and started going faster and faster. And eventually it was spinning around like a top. And they tried to put it down. And it doesn't have wheels, the BK skids, so it hit the ground and it bounced back into the air. And when it hit the ground, of course, it stopped spinning and bounced back into the air. As soon as it bounced up, it sort of wobbled for a moment, and then it started spinning again. It hit the ground 4 times like that. The skids were shattered. And fortunately, the rotors turned in the direction that they did, because each time it hit the ground, it moved further away from this steep drop down the side over here and onto the more gentle slope. And the 5th time, it hit the ground so hard that the tail broke off and the aircraft went over onto its side. And it was quite a mess. We managed to get out. You had to climb over one another and climb up to get to the door to open it to get out. We had a few bumps and scratches and so on, but we all survived it. And it was, it was frightening inside that aircraft. Every time it spun around, because I knew it had just been refueled. So it's chock-a-block with fuel. The slightest spark, and we're going to be incinerated. And I really thought this is the end. We're not going to make it. If it hits the ground once more, it's going to explode. And we get out of the aircraft, and one of the troops, he was actually amazing. The corporal, the section leader of this group. When he saw the helicopter coming in, he ran down from the container, to welcome us and greet us when we came out. And when he saw the helicopter start spinning and it hit the ground, he ran back to the container and grabbed the fire extinguisher. And he ran back to the chopper, and he was waiting with a fire extinguisher. It didn't burst into flames, but he was ready there in case it did. And I thought that he really kept his cool, that guy, by doing that. Anyway, we're standing next to the chopper then. So I had a camera. I always take a camera with me, and I quickly took some photos of the helicopter, and I got someone to photograph all of us. And the other helicopter came along afterwards. It saw all of this from where they were, saw it all happening, and then it came and landed. And those of us who'd been in the chopper, the pilots and all of us who were passengers, General Ferreira, he and he's a veteran of the border war. I mean, he commanded 32 Battalion, had been in many scraps and so on. But he pulls out his packet of cigarettes, and his hands were still shaking as he was lighting his cigarette like this. So I said to him, "Yeah, General, that was amper. That was really close." So he says, "Yeah, Mac, jy's reg." And I said to him, "Mike, ek moet jou sê, Generaal, ek het daarom hard gebid." I said, I must tell you, General, I was praying really hard. He says, "Ja, ek weet, ek het jou gehoor." So he says, "I know, I could hear you. I could hear you praying next to me there." So, I was just holding on to that walking stick of mine, and I was praying out loud because I thought, Lord, we're not going to get out of here alive. This is not the way I want to die. I don't want to get burnt to death in a helicopter. Then they loaded everybody into the helicopter, the Puma, and they unloaded some of the people there. And the others that they unloaded stayed behind with me, and they took the Puma and they took the guys back to safety and put them down somewhere, and sent all the reports in, and notifying the Air Force that the helicopter's been written off, and notifying everybody else that people are alive. So my wife is waiting back at home. She doesn't know anything about this. I mean, I'm away for a couple of days on this tour with showing the general around. And the next minute somebody arrives at the gate from the ops room and says to her, "Mrs. Alexander, we just want to tell you your husband's all right." So she says, "What do you mean he's all right?" They say, "No, he wasn't injured." She says, "Injured in what?" They say, "In the helicopter crash." She says, "What helicopter crash?" She says, "No, he was in a crash up in the mountains there, but he's all right." So she says, "Oh, well, thank you very much." That's the way she's informed of the things. Anyway, that was a little sideshow that happened there. But once again, I was just amazed at how the Lord held His hand on me at the time, and on all of us, because that could have been a real disaster. I mean, it would have been the Chief of Joint Operations and his 2IC. And the GOC of Regional Joint Task Force South and these 2IC all wiped out with the pilot and the co-pilot. While I was at Regional Joint Task Force South, I achieved a schoolboy ambition. There were two things. When I was at school, there were two things that I really wanted to do. I wanted to take part in the Doozy Canoe Marathon, and I wanted to run the Comrades. Those two things I really wanted to do. Now, I took part in the Doozy Canoe Marathon the year a year after I'd matriculated, and and so I'd done that. I had, on numerous occasions, I trained for the comrades. And every time something happened, I was either deployed somewhere, or on one occasion I did a free fall jump and broke my foot, and I'd been training, and I'd done all the qualifying marathons and so on, and they had my name down and everything, and I wasn't able to do it. So I thought, now that I'm here in PE, and I've got a reasonably routine sort of job, I'm going to start training for it. And the amazing thing was that I would. This was only a couple of years after I'd been shot through my knee, and I wasn't sure how my knee was going to take to it, but I did the necessary training, and I went down to the infantry school, and I did a marathon there to qualify, and I ran lots of half marathons and 10 kilometer and 15 kilometer races, and then I thought, well, I'd better do a longer than just a marathon, just to get myself into shape. And so I did the Brandkieshoogte marathon, which was, I think, 50 kilometers between where was it, Somerset East, and I think it was, I can't remember. It was somewhere, I think we ended in Somerset East, Craddock to Somerset East, something like that. Anyway, it was a 50 kilometer ultra marathon. And then I did the ultra marathon. I think it was called the Settlers Ultra Marathon from Grahamstown to Port Alfred, which was 60 kilometers. So I did all the necessary preparation, and then but I wasn't training with anybody else. I just trained on my own. Just had to figure it out how I was going to do it myself. And then I drove through to Pietermaritzburg, and I took part in the comrades, and I finished it. So, and my knee didn't give me any trouble. My ankles and my feet hurt me quite a bit, but my knee was fine. So I did the down run from Pietermaritzburg to Durban, which was rather a nice, little accomplishment for me to be able to manage to get that done. I also started doing Scottish country dancing again. Many years before that, 32 years before that, I'd been very active in Scottish country dancing. I'd done it in Johannesburg at what was known as the 51st Club, because it had been established in 1951. And here I found that the 51st Club was celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2001, and they were going to have a big ball. And they wanted to get as many of their old members to come and dance again. So I contacted them, and I said, look, they don't do Scottish country dancing in Port Elizabeth. Is there any? I go up to Pretoria quite often. Is there any place in Pretoria? And so they gave me the name of the Pretoria Scottish country dancing club, and I went along there. Every time I'd go to Pretoria, I'd make sure that I was there on a Thursday, because on a Thursday evening, they used to do Scottish country dancing. And I started dancing again because I was very rusty. I mean, I hadn't done any for 32 years. And I started dancing again. And that was really good. So I arranged to go up to Pretoria with Anne to attend this and to attend the ball. And I contacted one of the girls that I used to take to the balls when I used to still play or still dance in my youth. I contacted her and told her I was going, and she said, well, she would really like to go as well. So she started going back to the 51st Club. She also hadn't danced for all that time, and started brushing up on her dancing. And then the night of the ball came, and Anne and I went, and this girl, Diana Beadle, she and her husband came along, and he doesn't do Scottish country dancing, and Anne doesn't do Scottish country dancing. So the two of them sat over there, and I danced with Di for the night of the ball, which was really nice. You know, I was able to wear my kilt again, and it was all very formal, and it was a great occasion. So I was very glad that I had that opportunity, and it was a relax. And then I enjoyed it so much that I continued dancing every time I went to Pretoria after that. And I eventually, when I was transferred back to Pretoria, I was very active, and I danced with them for probably about 12 or 15 years that I was regularly dancing with them. I can't anymore because I hardly ever go to Pretoria anymore. But it was great for that period when I did do it, because I really enjoyed doing the country dancing. The Parachute Brigade had, in the meantime, been relegated to a regiment. And all the non-infantry elements had completely lost their airborne status and gone back to because the whole army had changed the way it functions, and it started functioning in silos, you know, all the infantry under the infantry formation, all the artillery under the artillery formation, and that's how they were working. So, you know, the brigades were just headquarters. They didn't have any units, and the units would be given to them if they needed to do an exercise or an operation. So it was very different from the way it had been in the past, and I don't think it was better by any means. I think it was not a good system. They had some very unfortunate things happening at the what became the Parachute Regiment. They had an arms theft. There were a couple of right-wing guys in the Parachute Brigade who managed to steal a whole lot of arms from the brigade, and they were caught, and it was a massive scandal. And then the brigade wanted to arrange a Kasinga Day parade. They arranged it, a Kasinga Day parade. And it was not a very clever thing to do, because the ANC government were obviously incensed by this. And, you know, the chief of the Defence Force had to offer an apology, and the Minister of Defence apologized to Namibia. And it was a whole issue. And, you know, in the end, the brigade commander was fired. And he was to be the last white brigade commander. In fact, after that, the brigade became a regiment, and they only appointed black guys after that. You know, the paratroopers had now blotted their copybook with this right-wing arms theft and the Kasinga Day parade, and it was insensitive. It was looking for trouble. You know, whichever way you look at it, the Namibians look at Kasinga in a very different way to the way we look at the Kasinga. And the government was now the ANC. And if you want to offend the ANC, that's the sort of thing you do. And it seems that the guys didn't really consider all the implications. So it was sad, but that's the way it had gone. I was now, of course, no longer a part of the paratroopers, so it didn't concern me directly in any way at all. You know, I was sad to see what was happening, but it was not part of my life in that part of the Defence Force where I found myself. And during the years after I left the brigade, other than visiting the brigade once during the integration, I wanted to take photographs of what was taking place with the integration and how the various, 32 Battalion and the TDF and the CDF and the BOP Defence Force and the SADF were all being integrated, and how the brigade was going to manage that. So I went and I interviewed the colonel who was there then, Pitnell, who was a good friend of mine, who's dead now. He was murdered during a car hijacking at his home many years ago. But I interviewed him, and he did a fine job of the integration, I think. It was his successor who unfortunately got fired because of all the other things that happened. But other than that, I'd occasionally go and attend a parade if I was invited, and whenever I could, I would go and jump with them. But then it would just be there for the jump, and I'd disappear again. I deliberately avoided getting involved in anything because it's not for me as a former commander to now try and dictate to the guys who are taking over. They've got their own things to do. It's you don't do that in the military. It's just not done. So, you know, I hadn't really had contact with them since I'd handed over command, and that had been 10 years earlier. So, but I retained my interest in things airborne, and you know, I'd kept my finger on internationally on what was happening and developments, and watching with a sort of from a distance of what was happening in South Africa. And in 2001, there was a symposium that was arranged by PISA, the Parachute Industries of Southern Africa. And I was invited to deliver a paper at this airborne symposium, which I did, in which I pleaded for a Parachute Brigade headquarters to again be established, and pointed out the reasons why this should be so. At that symposium, I had a major disagreement with a major general from Army headquarters, a former SADF guy, a white major general, who was parachute qualified, but he never served in a parachute unit. And quite honestly, he knew nothing about parachute operations, absolutely nothing. He was a very highly regarded officer, and had done very well for himself with a tremendous amount of command experience. You know, when I had to go to the infantry school and be assessed to see whether I'd have to do all sorts of courses, he was the guy who assessed me, and you know, he said, no, I don't have to do those courses. But he was absolutely against what I was saying. He got up and he said, there's no need for a brigade headquarters. We have shown time and again that if you need to do something, you can quickly put together a headquarters and you can carry it out. He said, we can do the same with an airborne. We can just get hold of all the paratroopers we've got. We know people who are parachute qualified, put them together, form a headquarters, and we can carry out the operation. Now, I couldn't believe that he was saying things like that. You know, that's so naive. And it just shows you how little he understood the implications of an airborne operation and what is required in order to carry out an airborne operation successfully. You don't just scratch a few people together. Being parachute qualified means you can jump out of an airplane, nothing more. It doesn't mean that you know how to run an airborne operation. It doesn't mean that you understand the logistics. It doesn't mean that you even understand the tactics. So you know, don't talk nonsense. But unfortunately, that's what he was doing. He was talking nonsense. And of course, he was a major general and I was a brigadier general. So I could hardly win an argument against him, but I made it very clear that I didn't agree with him. I didn't have much more to do with him, and he left the military a while after. I think he became the deputy chief of the army at one stage. I can't remember, quite honestly. But then something happened which radically affected the rest of my military career. A young officer who had been a sergeant in 14 Parachute Battalion Group. He was the sergeant of the mortar platoon. And later he became an officer. He was commissioned. He served in the brigade under me for a short period, and then he went off to the military academy. And after the military academy, he went to Wansai, and he served as a mechanized company commander. And after that, he went back to one parachute battalion, and he continued to serve in one parachute battalion, and later the parachute brigade, and then the parachute regiment. But he wasn't given command because of the affirmative action. By then, you know, he was So he was at that stage, he was a lieutenant colonel in the regiment. And on his initiative, they organized an exercise that they called a Iron Eagle exercise, after the Iron Eagle exercises that I had run when I was at the brigade. And for this exercise, he got 1 parachute battalion, and he got 6 PSI down in Grahamstown as an air-landed battalion. So he had a parachute battalion and an air-landed battalion, and he formed a tactical headquarters, brigade-level tactical headquarters. And he carried out an exercise in the Bethlehem area. And he got hold of, I don't know how he did it, but he got hold of, I think he had something like 4 Royfalk helicopters, the attack helicopters. He had several C-130s and CASA aircraft for the parachuting, and he had several Alouettes and quite a few of the new Oryx helicopters. And he did this exercise, which was a marvelous exercise, but and he invited me to come and attend the exercise. So I spoke to the GOC and I said to him, look, I'd like to attend the exercise. And he said, yeah, sure, you can go. So William Dixon, this young officer, he had invited me and asked me if I would evaluate what they're doing, because he would like to see them get a proper brigade, airborne brigade in existence again. And I went there, I participated I went with them in everything they did for the exercise. And I compiled a report on the exercise for the Chief of Joint Operations. And I pointed out all the shortcomings. I said, unless we do something about this, our capability has gone down the drain. We don't have the ability to support the guys logistically. We no longer have supporting arms. We don't have artillery. We don't have combat engineers. We don't have all the elements of a balanced force that we can carry out things. And these are the sort of jobs that they could be called on to do. So I was asked to carry out an investigation by the Chief of Joint Operations. He said he wants me to investigate the airborne capability in the Defence Force as a whole, and then present my findings to the Defence Command Council. And of course, I had my other job to do as the Chief of Staff. So it took me about a year to do all of that, because I had to go and visit various units and find out what had happened to the anti-aircraft guys and the artillery, and where they stood and what it would take to get them parachute trained again, and so on. And I did a presentation to the Defence Command Council, which included the Chief of the Air Force and the Chief of the Navy and the Chief of the Surgeon General, and of course the Chief of the Defence Force. And when they'd heard my story, they said we've got to establish a project. They asked me for my recommendations, and my recommendation was that we must establish a project to resuscitate the SANDF's airborne capability. So they approved it, and they established what was known as Project Cleopatra. And I was appointed as the project director, but I had to do it as an over and above responsibility, over and above my normal task. Anyway, I saw my way clear to doing that. And then when we got back to our headquarters, the Chief of Joint Operations said to me, he's going to appoint me, because the artillery had what they called a master gunner, and they've changed the name now. I think they call it the general of the artillery or something. But he used to be called the master gunner, and normally it was the most senior artilleryman in the Defence Force would be regarded as the master gunner, and he would just be like a sort of an honorary colonel. He would do what he can to support the artillery. And General Ngwenya, who was by then the Chief of Joint Operations, said to me he wants to, Les Rudman, when he had been the brigade commander, had created the post of Master Paratrooper. And he invited General Andre Bespier to become the Master Paratrooper. So he accepted that, and he was the Master Paratrooper. And he was supposed to play the same sort of role. But he had, in the meantime, now retired. He'd left. He'd taken a severance package and he'd gone. So there wasn't a Master Paratrooper. So General Ngwenya said to me, he's going to appoint me as the Master Paratrooper. So I said to him, well, sir, you know, shouldn't the brigade decide on who they want as a Master Paratrooper? He said, no. He said, I'm telling you now that I want you as the Master Paratrooper because I want you to advise me on all airborne matters. And I'm appointing you as the Master Paratrooper. So I said, well, that's fine. And I found myself traveling widely around the country as the Master Paratrooper and Director of Project Cleopatra, which was rather nice. It gave me some status, and people had to listen to me because I had the Chief of Joint Operations. His signature was under everything that I did, so I was able to do quite a lot, and that kept me very busy for the next few years. But at the same time, I was busy with doing other things as well. I delivered papers at the military academy was holding a conference every year called a War and Society Conference, looking at the impact of conflict on society as a whole. And they invited me to deliver papers. In fact, they sent out a call for papers, and I responded and said I'd like to I think 2002 was the first one they had, and I said I'd like to present a paper. So I presented a paper on the militarization of South African society. And then after that, for about 3 years after that, I continued to go to this conference every year at the military academy and to present a paper to them on, I moved away from the militarization of South African society, and my papers were more on the airborne side, which was the field of my specialization that I really wanted to sort of promote. But I also, during this time, I started reestablishing contact with my old friends from school days. From Potchefstroom. While I'd been at the brigade as a brigade commander, I had taken it on myself to arrange the 25th anniversary after our writing of matric, 25 years afterwards. And because I was at the brigade, and when I was doing this, I was invited by the school to take the salute of the annual cadet retreat ceremony. In those days, the school still had cadets, and so it was rather a nice feeling for me to stand there and take the salute on the same field where 25 years earlier I'd been participating in the parade as a platoon sergeant, as the Milton Senior Platoon Sergeant, going around the field. Then we had our dinner just after that. And 10 years later, when I was in PE, with the task force, my close friend Basil Klitz arranged the 35th anniversary of our having written matric. And so I went up to Potch for that. And it just struck me how close all the guys were, even though all those years had gone by, and they still had this real deep friendship with one another. So Basil and I decided to make a big event of our 40th. And we contacted the old girls from the girls' high and the convent. We set up a committee, and we tried to trace as many of the people as we could. And we got hold of most of them. There were very few that we weren't able to trace. I started writing some memoirs about our class, getting stories from the various people and putting them down and writing those memoirs. And I sent out a weekly newsletter using email, because now we had email, and this made a huge, big difference. So just a short little newsletter. And as the years went by, the newsletter grew and grew, and it became what I call the Clan Chronicle, because we called ourselves the Clan, the people from the class of 1965. And those who are maybe a year or two ahead and a year or two behind us that, had been very much a part of our group. And because I was traveling so much doing my job, whenever I'd get to a place like Durban or Cape Town or Kimberley or Potch or Pretoria or Polokwane or any of these places, I would contact all the people in that area, and we'd have a little gathering at a restaurant or somewhere and just spend a couple of hours together. So the guys were getting to make contact with one another and keeping in touch with what was going on. And we had these gatherings of the clan all over the country as I traveled around. And I wrote the weekly newsletter for a total of 10 years. And then after that, I wrote it monthly for about another 6 years. So, and I subsequently arranged our 45th and our 50th. All of them were great successes. We had people coming from all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand, the United States, Italy, the UK, all over the place. The guys would especially come out to South Africa for this reunion. And we had, at the one we had a ball, and at another one we had a 60s evening, and we had a bowls competition, and all. So we had, we didn't have just a dinner. We'd make it a whole weekend, 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we had programs for all of that. So they were great reunions, and because I was moving around so much, it was very easy for me to do it. While I was traveling, I'd phone the people and I'd say, look, I'm going to be in Kimberley, and that night contact there might only be about 5 people in the Kimberley area, but they'd all come together and we'd have a little gathering. So, and then the other thing I did during this time was I completed my master's degree. The year after I finished my honors degree, I left it for about a year, and then I enrolled for a master's. And it was 4 years of work. It was, but I'd done a lot of research beforehand when I was still OC at the brigade, and I used to go to the archives every Thursday, and I'd collect information over there. So I had a lot of information at my disposal. But I now did, with my traveling around, I interviewed people. I used the opportunity as best I could. And I selected to do the degree on the operation on Kasinga, the raid on Kasinga, for a number of reasons. The one was, it was the biggest airborne operation that South Africa had done. Secondly, it was in many ways a classical airborne operation because it was a parachute operation, solely a parachute operation, and it was an independent airborne operation. There were no ground forces that could support it. The only support could come from the air. So it was a true airborne operation. So, and there were a number of things that concerned me about Kasinga because they'd come to light when I was the brigade commander, and we were busy preparing and building the brigade, and I wanted to make sure that the lessons that had been learned at Kasinga were applied in what we were doing. And so I'd studied some of those lessons, and it concerned me that some of the things had happened that did happen. And I felt that I really wanted to get to the bottom of it and find out as much as I could, do a proper analysis of the operation. I felt that would be valuable for the future. So, my intention with studying the raid on Kasinga was to analyze it in considerable detail, to identify shortcomings and positive aspects, and see how the shortcomings could be addressed and the positive aspects could be reinforced in future airborne planning. The way I did it was I started off by sketching the military situation in southern Angola and northern Southwest Africa, or Namibia, at the time that Kasinga took place. In other words, early 1978. What was the military situation? SWAPO, Cuba, FAPLA, and SADF. Where they were deployed, what were the forces, what were the force levels, and what was the strategic intentions of the various combatants at that time. And then I homed in on Kasinga itself, and I looked at the nature of Kasinga and its defensibility, how it could be defended. And that was a controversial issue right from the start, because the nature of Kasinga by SWAPO and the Namibians and the Angolans and the ANC, according to them, it was a refugee camp. According to the South Africans, it was a military headquarters and base, and a legitimate military target. So, it was immediately controversial if you start looking at the nature and defensibility of Kasinga. So I had to dig around and get as much information as I could about these things so that I could get a balanced view of what actually happened, what was at Kasinga, in fact. It was difficult to get stuff from SWAPO. I did manage to contact one of the senior commanders, who was at that stage the chief of the Namibian army, General Shali. And he wasn't prepared to be interviewed, but he was prepared to answer questions. If I'd send him the questions, he'd reply to them. So I sent him a whole questionnaire with questions that I had. And he answered them all and sent them back to me. So that was a good source. I was also able to get transcripts from the University of Namibia of interviews with people who claimed to have been at Kasinga and who described their experiences at Kasinga from the SWAPO point of view. So I got quite a lot from them. I tried to get stuff from the Angolans. I visited their military attaché in Pretoria at the embassy. He was a major general. I've never heard of a military attaché being a major general, but he was. And he assured me he would get stuff for me. I never heard from him again. It didn't help it. The Cubans refused to see me. I couldn't get them. They wouldn't even allow me into the embassy to talk to them. So I couldn't find out anything from the Cubans. I had to rely on what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had written about the Cubans, because they claimed that it was the Cubans' greatest loss in all their operations they carried out. They suffered the greatest loss at Kasinga. But the Cubans wouldn't confirm or deny that. So, and I couldn't get access, obviously, to their records or anything. But I had a lot of information from the archives in Pretoria. There's a lot of information. I got intelligence files. I got operational files. I got operational reports. I got debriefings. I got reports that were written by all the commanders on the South African side the day after they'd carried out the operation. Each one had to write a personal report on their participation. And I got hold of all of those. So I had tremendous sources at my disposal. And I spent a lot of time in the archives. Again, I was traveling a lot. I was going to Pretoria a lot. And I often had time in Pretoria to spend in the archives and working on that. So I I was able to spell out the SADF's airborne capability at that time, what we had in terms of aircraft, in terms of paratroopers, in terms of the availability of paratroopers. I could set out why we had used a composite parachute battalion rather than an existing parachute battalion. And after having described the SADF's airborne capability, I went on to look at the decision that was made to carry out the attack. Why, on what grounds was the decision made, and what led to the decision being made. Then I looked at the planning and preparation that had taken place before the operation, all the preparations that had to be done before the operation could be carried out. And only then did I get down to the actual airborne assault which took place and describing that airborne assault. And then I did the Cuban counterattack and the extraction of the paratroopers. And then finally I wound up the whole dissertation with a section on the politics of propaganda, because there was propaganda that went out from both sides. That's the way it works in war. And the politics of this propaganda, I set out, and then I made some conclusions. I think it's important to say here that the supervisor, I had a supervisor and an assistant supervisor. The supervisor was Professor Greg Cuthbertson, who was the head of the history department at UNISA. And one of the lecturers there, Dr. Alex Mouton, was a co-supervisor. And the role of the supervisors was not to tell me what to write. That was my responsibility. I did that. I had to do the research, and I had to decide what I wanted to write. Their job was to see that in the research that I'm doing the research properly, that I'm formulating it in a way which is academically acceptable so that people can properly assess the work, and that it can be properly checked. So all the references, the way I do my references, all of that has to be correct. And those are the things that they did. If they disagreed with what I was saying, they were free to do so, but they could not tell me, you mustn't write that, you must write this. They could say to me, perhaps what you're saying there, perhaps you're posing it in a way which would be offensive to some people. You need to just consider this. And I would consider it. I don't have to accept that. But they'd give me advice on that sort of thing. But never did they try to tell me what I must write and how I must, or what the slant should be. They accepted the way that I did it, and that's the way it's supposed to be. So, people don't always understand that. They think that the supervisor tells you what to write. He does it. It's your work. It's not his work. He just keeps you within the parameters to make sure that what you produce is academically acceptable to the university, because it goes out under the university's name. I had 4 examiners. My supervisor was one, Professor Greg Cuthbertson. The co-supervisor, Dr. Alex Mouton, was another, and they had been through me with the whole way. Every time I'd finished a chapter, I'd have to send it to them, and they'd go through it, and they'd check it, and they'd come back with comments and so on. So they had followed the whole way it had gone. But for a master's degree, you have to get comments from, or you have to get examiners from not only the university that you're studying at, but also from at least 2 other universities. So they got the head of history, of the history department at the University of Cape Town, Professor Christopher Saunders, who was also quite an authority on the Namibian War, and Professor Albert Grundling, who was the head of the history department at the University of Stellenbosch. So those were the 3 universities that examined my dissertation, UNISA, UCT, and Stellenbosch. And there were 4 examiners. Of the 4 examiners, 3 of them gave me a distinction. in their marks. One of them, Professor Saunders, gave me, I think, about 2 points below a distinction. He had, in his comments, he had some, they all gave some very, very positive comments about my degree, about my dissertation. But Christopher Saunders, he took me on a bit and indicated that I wasn't quite as neutral as I was trying to make out I was. I had shown some bias towards the SADF. Now, that's interesting to see because most of my detractors accused me of exactly the opposite. But anyway, that's what he said. So on the balance, the degree was awarded to me with distinction. In other words, I got it cum laude with my MA degree. The main issues of contention, because look, it was extremely controversial. It took a while before people woke up to the fact that they didn't like what I'd said, some of the things that I'd said. But the main issues of contention were, and what is important to understand, and a lot of the people who tackled me about my dissertation clearly don't understand this. You base what you're stating in your dissertation on the balance of facts that you get at your disposal and the sources that you consult. And so when I said certain things, it wasn't me saying that. I was saying what this source had said, and they didn't like that. They didn't like that some people said things that they didn't want to hear. And this was particularly so amongst some of those who actually were participants, who jumped at Kasinga and who participated there. One of the things that I mentioned was that it seemed fairly clear to me that the operation would probably have gone better if it had been done by national service paratroopers rather than so many citizen force paratroopers. There were a large number of citizen force paratroopers. The majority of those who jumped were citizen force paratroopers. So there was certainly a large percentage that were citizen force. And there were only two reasons why I said that, and that was based purely on the feedback that came out at the debriefs after the operation. One was that the national service paratroopers have been operating in operations with one another for a long period of time. They know every person in their section. They know the section commander, and they always operate together. So while they're at the peak of their operational readiness during their national service. In the citizen force, they have to be brought back up to that level of soldiering again before they can actually be employed, and that takes a bit of time. It's also so that they're not necessarily with the people that they're accustomed to being with. They're not with, some of them might be, but they won't all be with the guys that they were with during national service. And they're likely to have a different section commander and a different platoon commander. And they may have done one or two short camps, 3 weeks or something like that, or may even have been deployed for 2 months or so in the operational area. But that's a little different from being deployed for a whole year with people that you know intimately now. You know exactly how they work you've been in numerous contacts with them. You know exactly how people respond and what you can rely on with a person. So there are definite advantages to using a full-time paratrooper as opposed to a part-time paratrooper for an operation of this nature. And that came out in the debrief. It's one of the things that was addressed in the debrief, and that's why I mentioned it. You can't ignore this sort of thing if it was thought as as important enough to discuss in the debrief. You also had the problem with your citizen force soldiers that they were married, many of them, with families, and this placed an additional strain on them. And when a person is killed and he leaves a widow and children behind, it's very different to when a person is killed and he has no one he's leaving behind other than his parents, of course. But he doesn't leave a wife and child that have now got to fend for themselves without him there anymore. And this certainly affects the thinking of people when they are deployed. It affects the thinking of their officers as well. They have to bear some of these things in mind. So there are complications. But then the other aspect, and that came out very strongly in the debriefing, was that the citizen force soldiers are not necessarily battle fit after only a few days or a week or two of training. They haven't been, their level of fitness is not yet at the level that the national servicemen are. The national servicemen are hyper fit. And these citizen force guys know that. When they were national servicemen, they were hyper fit. But it's almost an impossibility to achieve that same level of fitness when you're in the citizen force. Some guys do because they focus on their fitness, but not everybody does. And so you have varying levels of fitness. It's impossible to call up a citizen force unit and think that everybody's going to be on the same level of fitness. It doesn't happen. Whereas in a national service unit where the guys are full-time and they've been there and they've gone through a year of training and then a year of operations, they're very much on the same level of fitness. That they've achieved that. So these were points that I brought out. Unfortunately, a lot of the guys objected to that very, very strongly. They didn't like the fact that this was brought to light. So and the interesting thing is that some of the sources that I used were written by some of the commanders who had forgotten that they'd written this in their reports because it was so long ago. They couldn't remember that they'd actually written this in the reports and said that the level of fitness was not up to standard for the troops. Battle fitness was lacking. And these were citizen force people, commanders who'd written this, and now they accused me of talking nonsense when I mentioned it in my dissertation. So I saw their reports. They were all there. I've got copies of them. They were in the archives. So there were people just didn't like anything that said about it that was negative. I also pointed out that there was a lot of chaos with the command and control. Now, it's generally accepted that the command and control was poor. And it was poor because of General du Plessis, who was a brigadier at the time, insisting on jumping with the guys. He was tasked to be in an airborne command post, but he decided he wanted to jump to be on the ground there. It was he wanted to be part of the action. I mean, every paratrooper wants to jump into action, so that's what he wanted to do. But that he wasn't tasked to do that. He was told to man an airborne command post. If he'd done that, a lot of the things that went wrong wouldn't have gone wrong. So there was a problem with the command and control. Where the other people see the problem, where my critics see the problem with the command and control, was that they felt, and Jan Breitenbach, who was the battalion commander, has said this himself in his book on Kasinga. There was no role for Brigadier du Plessis. He should never have been there. There was just a battalion commander. There was no brigade commander. Now, unfortunately, the facts, the planning for the operation, the documentation, the debriefing, everything else gives the lie to that. There was a brigade commander. There was a brigade headquarters. In fact, in Jan Breitenbach's handwritten orders, he refers to the brigade headquarters. And he makes provision for the brigade headquarters with the extraction, in his extraction plan. The communication plan with the radios makes provision for a brigade headquarters. So there was a brigade headquarters there, whether one likes it or not. But the brigade headquarters should not have been on the ground in Kasinga. They should have been in the air. And that's the problem. But people want to try and wish them away, that they were not part of the operation. They were part of the operation. And for a large period of the operation, there was no communication between General Gleason at Ondangwa at the tactical headquarters and with Jan Breitenbach, who was running the operation on the ground. And if the brigade commander had been in the aircraft where he was supposed to be, he would have been able to relay the messages, and there wouldn't have been that breakdown in communication. But that didn't happen. So people are very annoyed about that. Well, then unfortunately they've got to, they're welcome to be annoyed. I got that from all the documentation that was at my disposal in the archives, and it's all there for anybody to see. And my references are all there in my dissertation. Anyone who takes the trouble to check those references and go into the archives and find those files themselves and see what is written there, they can see that. But they prefer to throw accusations at me as if I'm pulling these things out of my hat. The other thing was that I pointed out that there was considerable chaos during the evacuation and at the time of the Cuban counterattack. Now, unfortunately, that's not my view. That's the view of numerous people who were there, including General Constant Viljoen, who was there at the time. I interviewed him and I read his inputs during the debriefing conference in which these aspects were addressed. And there was a considerable amount of confusion on the ground. Fortunately, it all worked out and everybody got away. But it could very easily have gone wrong. And what I had to do was look at why we went through such a chaotic situation on the ground there, and how do we avoid that happening in future? And that's what I was trying to do. But I was castigated for it, because how dare I say that there was chaos on the ground, that there was a breakdown in command and communication? Well, I don't say it. The people who were there say it. And the debriefing report addresses that specifically. The debriefing report at which Jan Breitenbach, General Dup, the commander of 2 and 3 parachute battalions and 1 parachute battalion, they were all there. And they were at the conference where those things were discussed. That's what the conference minutes say. That's what I worked on. So then the other aspect that they are very unhappy about is that I said that it was a refugee camp. I never said it was a refugee camp. I said that there were civilians there. And there are many of the participants who I interviewed who confirmed that there were civilians there, and there were civilians who were killed. They were killed in both the bombing by the Air Force and in the fighting in the trenches. There were civilians. The insurgents who took cover in the trenches were there with civilians. And in the fighting in the trenches, civilians died. And that was inevitable and unavoidable under those circumstances. So those were casualties of war, and that was a reality. One can't wish away civilians if there were civilians there. There were even children there. I don't know how many. There were certainly some babies there, and there were some babies that were killed. But that's what happens in a war. There were very few attacks on any bases where there weren't some civilians there. It is what happens. So I was also accused of saying that the paratroopers massacred the civilians. Now, the term massacre needs to be analyzed. According to the South African Oxford English Dictionary, a massacre is a brutal and indiscriminate killing of people. That's a massacre. Brutal and indiscriminate. I don't think anybody can deny that when you drop bombs on a base, that's indiscriminate. You can't determine where that bomb's going to land. You can't say that that bomb's not going to kill any civilians that might be there. It's indiscriminate. And I don't think anybody could deny that the fighting that took place in the trenches was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. It was a question of survival. Fighting in trenches is brutal. It's a brutal form of fighting because of the confined and restricted space that you're operating in. And when you're throwing hand grenades into bends, around bends in the trenches, and you're shooting any person or anything that moves, that's brutal. That's brutal. But that's warfare. That's the way it works with warfare. So if you want to call that sort of thing a massacre, then there was a massacre of people. People were killed, but it was not a deliberate intention to kill innocent people. There's no doubt about that. And looking at everything that you find in the documentation, there is never any indication that there was any attempt, deliberate attempt, to kill innocent people. On the contrary, there were specific orders given to avoid civilian casualties, not to kill women and children. There were specific orders given for that. So the fact that massacre is a nasty word. It's got nasty connotations. But if you take if you start defining it, then any sort of fighting could be regarded as a massacre by the victors over those who have lost. And there were lots of people killed brutally and indiscriminately. That's the way it works with a pre-bombardment, whether it's by artillery or whether it's by aeroplanes. It's indiscriminate as regards the area that the target is located in. So I don't think I tried to imply that the paratroopers were deliberately killing people indiscriminately, because I don't think they would have done that. These people were, after all, civilians in uniform. They had families of their own. What would have possessed them to suddenly start killing a whole lot of innocent civilians? It doesn't make any sense. And there's one writer, Gerald Lange, who wrote a book called The White Africans, and he was by no means a conservative. He was quite a liberal writer, and he was certainly not favorably disposed in his writing towards the South Africans. But one of the things that he writes is, he says, despite all the accusations that have gone out about what had took place at Kasinga, no one has yet explained why the South Africans would have taken such an enormous risk, because that operation was enormously risky, would have taken such an enormous risk to kill a lot of innocent refugees. What was the purpose? There were delicate negotiations going on with the five representatives who were trying to bring about some sort of negotiated settlement. It was a delicate situation with the United Nations. To go and deliberately attack a refugee camp and kill a whole lot of civilians at the risk of losing irreplaceable aircraft and suffering unacceptable casualties if one of those aircraft is shot down, just to kill a lot of civilians. What would be the point of doing that? He says nobody's explained that yet. And, I tend to agree with that. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So whatever people want to believe, you're not going to change the way they believe. I'm not going to change the way that they think. But my dissertation is there for anyone to read, and I've had many people read it, including people who were there, who have said that that's probably the best description we've come across of what took place, the most analytical, the most careful. You see, people say, how can I write about Kasinga? I wasn't there. Well, how can people write about Napoleon? How can they write about the Duke of Waterloo, who is one of Jan Breitenbach's heroes? And Jan Breitenbach writes about the Duke of Waterloo, but at least the Battle of Waterloo. The Jan Breitenbach writes about the Duke, but he wasn't there. He wasn't at Waterloo. But the facts are there for the historians to consider. So one of the reasons why I selected Kasinga to write about was precisely because I was never there. I felt if I'm going to write about it, I'm going to have a narrow view of the situation. I want a broad view. I would rather select an operation that I was not involved in, that I can have a broader view of what was taking place. Otherwise, you're myopic. You're microscopic. You're not looking at the broader picture. And that's what I was trying to do in my intention with this dissertation. I had some interesting repercussions coming from this. One of the former the old paratrooper organizations sent me an ultimatum. They told me that they have studied my dissertation. I very much doubt that. Most people who tell me they've studied the dissertation have read an extract that somebody else has shown them. They've never bothered to read the whole thing and see everything that I wrote in context. Reading through an academic dissertation is hard work, and it's hard intellectual work, and a lot of people are not prepared to apply themselves to do that sort of hard intellectual work. But what they said to me was, we've decided. Now, this is an organization of maybe 100 people. And one must bear in mind that since the parachute training started in South Africa in 1962, 61, 62, some 20,000 paratroopers have been trained. And this is an organization of maybe 100 of them. Even if it's 200, I doubt whether it's 100, but even if it's 200 of them, what percentage of the paratroopers is that? But they said, unless you publicly state that you are altering what you wrote in that dissertation of yours, and you withdraw it, we are going to excommunicate you from the fraternity of paratroopers. Really? On what sort of grounds? What makes you guys representative of the 20,000 odd paratroopers that qualified? How many people do you really represent? And what gives you the status to excommunicate me or anybody else from the community of paratroopers? So the letter that they sent me, nobody had the guts to sign it. So it was an unsigned letter that they sent me by registered post, but it's unsigned. Nobody had the guts to sign it. I ignored it. So I was duly excommunicated from the fraternity of paratroopers, whatever that might mean. So, it was actually a joke. But there were other issues around it which I found very sad. I found very sad. Look, there were some people who took issue with me and were prepared to discuss it with me on a sensible level, without deteriorating, letting the discussion deteriorate into a mudslinging. Now, I'm not prepared to argue with people. I will debate with people happily on the level of what I wrote, so that we don't descend into name calling and mudslinging. But that's not what they want to do. They want to yell and shout at me. And some of them have said that when they checked what I've written and they found that they can't fault what I'd done, then they say to me, but yes, but you should not have written things like that. Even if it is true, you shouldn't have written things like that about the paratroopers. You're stabbing them in the back. Really? So the mistakes that were done, that were made by the British at Arnhem, should actually be swept under the carpet. And everybody should pretend that it was a wonderful operation, that nothing went wrong. That's all right. I'm sorry, I don't operate like that. So if that's what they want to do, I'm not prepared to descend into that sort of level and to start throwing nasty epithets around about people and accusing people of carrying out character assassination and so on. If they want to do that, then they must do that. I'm not prepared to do that. But there are many people who have disagreed with what I've written and have been prepared to discuss it with me. And I haven't been able to persuade them otherwise. They say, I'm sorry, this is what I still feel. Well, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. If people are free to believe what they want to, but I don't think they're free to call me names just because that's the only way they can get a dig at me. So the sad part of it is that some people who really mean a great deal to me have been, I've lost their friendship. And Jan Breitenbach is one of them. I regarded him as a good friend. I never served with him. I never served under him, which is why I find it difficult that in the book that he wrote, he was able to find such fault with my character and my military capabilities that I wondered where he found out all these things about me, because he certainly never operated with me. He never held command over me. But I had, and I still have, great respect for the man. I believe he's one of the finest operational commanders that we've produced, particularly in our war. And I think that he made a huge contribution, and he needs to be acknowledged for that. And I think in many ways he wasn't sufficiently acknowledged for some of the things that he did. He was pioneering in many ways. But unfortunately, it meant that our relationship soured, and he's no longer prepared to talk to me. It hasn't been for many years. Despite the fact that when I'd finished my dissertation, his son approached me and asked if he could have copies of the dissertation, which he wanted for himself, and he wanted to give one to his dad. And I said to him, if you'll pay the production costs, it costs me to print the things, and you're very welcome. And he gave his dad one of those. And it was only about 3 or 4 years later that suddenly it became a big issue. And Jan approached me on numerous occasions while he was writing his book, and he said, well, he disagrees with what I say about the command and control. On what grounds do I say this? And I'd say, Jan, I'll send you the brigade order. I'll send you some of the source documents, and you can check those, which I did, and which he never mentioned in his book. because it didn't suit the line that he was taking in order to support the people who, because prior to these people who were such detractors of everything that I said, making an issue about it, it wasn't a big problem with Jan. The only thing he really disagreed with when he spoke to me about my dissertation was he said, I don't think you got the command and control right. And I said, well, Jan, I'm only working on what the documents say, and I'll send you all the documents you want so that you can have a look at them. Anyway, sadly, my good relationship with Jan came to an end, and I regret that, because as I say, I have great respect for the man, and I would have liked to have maintained a good relationship with him, but that was not to be. So, I think that's about all I want to say about the dissertation that I'm for my master's degree. If there are people who would still like to discuss it with me in more detail and to debate the issues that I spoke about, I'm always happy to do that. But not to argue like and descend into the gutter. I don't think that's fitting. There's a lot more I could say about it, but I don't think I'm going to at this stage. In 2003, that same year that I finished my dissertation, I delivered a paper at a conference called a conference on airborne operations arranged by Aerodyne, another company that produces airborne equipment and so on in Pretoria. And then in 2004, the decision was made that the RJTFs are going to be closed down. And, they'd only been in existence for 4 years. Not even, I don't think, when the decision was made. And I found a very interesting development that affected me personally. Every year we'd be sent documents that we had to fill in. And these documents were what we saw as our future employment in the military. And one of the questions that they asked you in the document was, should you leave the military, what other direction would you like to go into? Is there any government department, other government department that you would want to go to, or anything like that? So I used to fill in that. If I have to leave the military, I would like to go to the Department of the National Parks Board, nature conservation. I'd go into that field. I think I could make a contribution there. So. And then there was a big conference somewhere. I stayed behind in Port Elizabeth and did my work there. And lo and behold, my GOC goes off to the conference, and lo and behold, the Chief of Staff of the Regional Joint Task Force East, Jan Hougaard, phones me. And he says, "Maak jou blikskottel. Hoe het jy dit nou reg gekry?" I said to him, "What are you talking about, Jan?" He says, "Nature conservation." I said, "What about nature conservation?" He says, "The job you've landed yourself with nature conservation." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "No, at the conference here, they've worked out where everybody is going in the new organization that they've got, and you were not staffed because you've got a post with nature conservation." I said, "John, I don't have a post with anybody." "What do you mean I'm not staffed?" "No, your name's not down. We've all been given new posts in the new organization and so on, but you haven't been given a post because you're going to nature conservation." So I went, when my GOC got back, I went to see him. I said, "What's this?" He said, "No, I don't know. The guys who handle the personnel matters, they told me that you've got a job with nature conservation, so we don't have to staff you anyway." So I said, so I don't have a job with anybody. I just filled in the form that everybody fills in, and I said that if I have to leave the military, I'd be prepared to go to nature conservation. Eventually, I went up to Pretoria to see General Ngwenya. He was so apologetic, man. No, it's a mistake. Somebody made a mistake somewhere along. But you'll still get a salary. I said, yeah, but what job am I going to have? He said, no, well, there isn't a job for you now. Next thing is they transferred my GOC away. And I get a signal comes through appointing me as GOC in his place. But I mean, the task force has got to close down now. So I'm appointed as the GOC. I don't get promoted. I stay a brigadier general, but now I'm the GOC of this headquarters that is closing down. And I get another message to say, I'm going to be held responsible for closing down all 5 regional joint task forces. The people for those task forces, the GOCs are being withdrawn and they're being deployed in other posts, and the chiefs of staff are being deployed elsewhere, and there'll be a handful of people left behind to do the closing down, and I've got to oversee the closing down of all these regional joint task forces. So, in theory, I've got a task, I've got a job now. They can hold me against a post, but it doesn't mean anything. So, my GOC has a big parade, and I get handed the sword of command and all the rest of it, but it's like a joke, because so the task force, I had to close it down, but I had to travel around and close down all these task forces. And I continued with Project Cleopatra. So I had plenty to do, but they didn't have a post for me. During this time, the other thing was that there were a number of border bases that were being run by the task forces in running their operations on border control. But now border control had been taken from the military and given to the police. So all these border bases had to be closed down. So I also had to oversee the closing down of those border bases. So for 2 years, I drove around from one place to another, checking that things are closing down, checking, going through lists and so on, and getting all of that sort of thing done. It kept me out of their hair. Somebody was doing the work. But the time came when I'd have to go to General Ngwenya and say, sir, all the RJTFs are closed down. All the border bases are closed down. What are you going to do with me now? And then it became a problem for them, because then I became what they call a supernumerary. I'm being paid a salary, but I haven't got a job. So, I prepared myself. I still had about, I think, 3 or 4 years to go before my retirement. I prepared myself to, what am I going to do? I don't know. I'll carry on working on Project Cleopatra and trying to resuscitate the airborne capability. And I'll do that full time now. But in the meantime, we'd been having all sorts of woes with our youngest child, Christine, who had been involved in the hostage crisis and had played such a courageous role during the whole thing, and who came back and found that nobody even knew who she was when she came back to South Africa. And so she was constantly looking for a way to get that sort of attention that she got before. And she went completely off the rails. She got involved in drugs. Her schoolwork took a dive. Anne and I were running around in circles trying to resolve her issues. She became impossible to live with. So we didn't have a very happy situation at home. And any parent who's had a child on drugs would understand what I'm saying when I say that it was a very, very difficult situation. But then General Ngwenya phones me one day and he says, Mac, would you be prepared to take a job in Pretoria? Because I've got a post available for you in Pretoria. So I said, of course, sir. I'll go wherever you want me to go. If you've got a post for me, that's where I'll go. he says, I want you to become the director of doctrine development, because the person who's there now has been transferred elsewhere, and I'd like you to take that post. So I said, well, thank you, sir. I'll do that with pleasure. So I had to go up to Pretoria. The first year I was alone up there because Christine was in matric, and we had to try and get her through matric. So Anne stayed behind in Port Elizabeth and tried to coach her through matric. Fortunately, she'd already been basically kicked out of the school that she was in, but the principal said to us, take her out, otherwise we're going to have to kick her out. But put her into this cram college school and they'll be able to sort her out. To my great surprise, they did. And she got through her matric. Didn't get her off of the drugs, but they did get her through matric. So Anne stayed down here in Port Elizabeth with Christine. I went up to Pretoria and started running my new office as Director of Doctrine Development. After a year, Anne moved up, and James Hills, who had left the army back in 1993 and was farming, he had two farms adjacent to one another, and his daughter had been living in the one house, and he and his wife in the other house, and then his daughter immigrated to New Zealand, and the house was standing empty. And he said, don't you want to come and stay in that house? So we did. We moved into the house on the farm, and I commuted. I was working in Pretoria. I'd go through at 4 o'clock on a Monday morning. I'd drive through to Pretoria. And at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, I'd drive back to Potchefstroom and just spend the weekend at home. And Anne would stay on the farm alone. And we were there for 2.5 years. It was until I retired. It was really nice on the farm. We enjoyed that very much. I wish I could have spent more time there, but I felt that I'm being paid a job to work in Pretoria. I've got to do the job, because the job was to oversee and check all joint op doctrine in the Defence Force. Every time a new doctrine publication would come out, I with my staff officers from the various arms would go through it and look at all the joint aspects and approve the document. We'd have to go and check certain things and so on. I had a colonel from each of the services working for me, and then a few lieutenant colonels as well. And I found myself chairing the work group on a peace support operations doctrine and building up a doctrine from scratch for peace support operations, which we did with the assistance of the BMAT guys from the British Army. And I think we produced a pretty good document. So I'm quite proud of that. But the next thing is, and in fact, this happened 8 months after I'd assumed the job as Director of Doctrine Development. We were going to have a visit from the Deputy Minister of Defence. At that stage, it was a fellow called Muleleki George. And he was going to come and visit the Joint Operations Headquarters. So we prepared this huge briefing for him. And we are in one of the big halls at the back of the headquarters. We had all the people from Joint Operations there. And this deputy minister comes, and we brief him on all the operations that we're busy with and how we're doing everything, and how the organization is designed to be able to do it all. And when the staff officers who had been briefing him were finished, and General Ngwenya had explained what he wanted to, he asked Deputy Minister, would you like to say anything, or do you have any questions? So he gets up and he looks around at us. He stands there and looks around and he says, yes, I have only one question. Why do I see so many white faces in front of me here? It was obvious that that man had not listened to a word that we had said to him. He was not interested in his job as the Deputy Minister of Defence. He wasn't interested in defence. He wasn't interested in what the military was doing on the operational level. He had no interest in that. He was only interested in affirmative action. He wanted white people to get out and black people to get in. That's all he was interested in. Doesn't matter about the other things. The Defence Force can fall flat as far as he's concerned. He wants black people in positions. That's it. I listened with total disbelief. I couldn't believe what the man was saying. He was not just a politician. He sounded like an idiot. He wasn't interested in what the military were doing. And he's the minister, the deputy minister of defense. Well, thank goodness he didn't last much longer after that. But unfortunately, the next day I get called in by General Ngwenya. And he says to me, Mac, we're going to have to replace you as Director of Doctrine Development. I said, why, sir? Are you unhappy with the work I'm doing? He said, no. You're doing a good job. You've got the highest merit of all the brigadier generals in Joint Ops. I said, if that's the case, sir, then why are you getting rid of me? He says, the minister doesn't like so many white people in headquarters. We've got to get rid of. So I said, so I've got the best merit in joint operations, but I'm the guy who has to go. He said, well, you know, it's a question of last in, first out sort of thing. And so I said, okay, sir. And this is where I really found out. Even General Ngwenya, who I had a lot of respect for, I felt he was a good general, but he said something there that shattered my illusions completely. I said to him, sir, if I have to go because of affirmative action, I understand. I realize that affirmative action has to take place. I realize that we have to get the balance right within the Defence Force, and I accept that. And if I have to be a casualty, I also accept that. But sir, we're doing some very important things with joint doctrine at the moment. And it concerns me, we must get the right person in to be able to continue that work. Who have you got in mind to replace me? And then he said it. He said to me, Mac, I haven't got anybody in mind, but it doesn't matter who he is as long as he's black. It doesn't matter who he is. The Director of Joint Doctrine for the Defence Force, it doesn't matter who he is as long as he's black. That finally sorted out my illusions, because that I was totally disillusioned with the Defence Force after that, totally disillusioned. I couldn't believe that the Chief of Joint Operations would say a thing like that to me. It doesn't matter who he is as long as he's black. Well, they couldn't find anybody to take over the job from me. It was more than a year, nearly 2 years, before I took one of the colonels, a former MK colonel who'd worked for me at RJTF South. He was a SSO intelligence, and he was a bright guy. And I went to see Ngwenya and I said, sir, you're looking for somebody to replace me. I want to recommend Gordon. He's the guy who you should get. And he said to me, do you think he can do the job? I said, yes, I think he can do the job. So he said, well, thank you. And then he promoted that guy and he took the job. And I found myself again as a supernumerary. I didn't have a job. I was getting a salary, but I didn't have a job. And I had 2 years to go before I was going to retire. So I asked them for an office, and they gave me a little tiny office underneath the stairwell. And that's all I had. I had no secretary. I had nothing. I just had this little office. And I worked on Project Cleopatra until I retired. That's all I did. It became my full-time job. Every time there was an exercise, I'd attend the exercise and I'd assess the airborne side of the exercise. If it was an airborne exercise, I'd assess the whole exercise. I submitted reports and recommendations on every exercise. Some of them really offended the SAF, really raised their ire, because their pilots, their transport pilots, had lost all tactical capability. They didn't know how to fly tactically. They didn't know how to fly at the right height so they wouldn't be picked up by radar, to come in at treetop height pitch up just before dropping, drop the troops, and then drop down again. And they didn't know how to fly in a way which would confuse the heat-seeking missiles. They hadn't been taught any of that. The guys who understood all of that were now gone. They'd left, they'd retired or taken severance packages, and they were gone. And the new guys, all they could do was fly an aeroplane. It was like paratroopers who can jump out of an aeroplane, but they can't do anything else. These guys could fly an aeroplane, but they couldn't do anything else. I'd say to them in an exercise, I'd say, you dropped the guys and you were flying from west to east for a first light drop. Why did you do that? They say, well, that's the way that we worked out our route. I said, but you don't drop paratroopers flying from west to east at first thing in the morning. You fly from the east to the west so that the enemy, when they are looking up, they look into the sun. Oh, we hadn't thought about that. I said, this is basic tactics for the Air Force, and you people don't know how to apply your own tactics. So when I would put this in the reports, the Air Force guys got very uptight about it. They were very unhappy about it. The old Air Force pilots would never have done such stupid things. They were trained. They knew how to do this sort of thing. Anyway, I got the opportunity to go overseas to look at how other people were doing it. And I elected to go to Spain. So in 2005, I went to Spain to study the Fuerza de Acción Rápida, the FAR, which is a divisional level organization that Spain have got at the disposal of NATO for rapid reaction. And this is, it consists of a headquarters with a parachute brigade, an air-landed brigade, and an aviation regiment of helicopters, and then a light armored regiment to back up the airborne forces. And all the necessary support in terms of artillery and engineers and logistics and signals and all the rest in it. So I went over and spent a while there visiting all these places and making notes and so on. But the joy of that visit was that the GOC of the FAR, the FAR, the Fuerza de Acción Rápida, was a Major General Bernardo de Manzanares. He'd been one of my buddies in class when I was on the joint staff, on the staff course in Spain. And because he was a paratrooper, we became quite good friends. And I'd visited him at home, and I knew his wife, and Anne knew his wife, and you know, he was a good friend of mine. So he was thrilled when I was coming, but he didn't tell his staff that he knew me. So I arrived there, and he's got all his staff lined up in front of all the staff officers lined up in front of the headquarters. And he comes to the vehicle that I get out of there, that military attaché brought me there, and you know, I'm in uniform, and he greets me, and quite formally, and introduces me to each of the officers. And we go inside, and now one of them is going to give me a briefing on the whole organization. And we're sitting in the briefing room, and he's got his maps and his organograms and everything else is out there, and overhead projector and everything else. I think it was still overhead projectors. I don't know. Maybe we were already on to Lipros and things by then. But anyway, he's got all his stuff ready, and it's a lieutenant colonel there, and he's standing there. But now he's in his best English. Now he starts giving me this briefing. You see. But I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and I can see the guy, he's battling with his English, you know. I look at Bernardo, and he looks at me and he winks. And so I say, Coronel, si quieres, puedes continuar en español. And he looks at me like this, his eyes go wide, and he turns and looks at the general, and Bernardo starts laughing, and he says, yes, he says, this general is one of my course mates from the staff course. He's done the Spanish staff course. You can speak to him in the Spanish. It's not a problem. So that was rather good. Anyway, I had a great visit to Spain, and I spent a lot of time with my old friends who were over there. And Bernardo gave me, he gave me access to anything except the highly classified stuff, obviously. But anywhere I wanted, he couldn't do enough for me. He arranged visits all over the place to do all sorts of things. And I got to the Parachute Brigade, and they did a demonstration there of all their parachute training and so on. And I didn't really need that because, I wasn't looking at the level of parachute training. I was looking at the level of how they function. But when you go to a parachute brigade or battalion, they've always got to show you how they do their training and how tough they are and so on. And so they were jumping out of this, the equivalent of our ARPCOS, to show me how they did their exits and so on. And so one of the officers says to me, General, would you like to try? And I said, yes, of course. So I went up and I jumped up. But, I had my tunic that I had to take off first of all, and I was in my step-out shoes and so on. But I did a jump out of the ARPCOS for them because it kept them happy anyway. So it was a great visit. I really found it worthwhile, and I think I picked up a lot of value from that. Okay, so I got back from Spain, and the following year, in fact, which would have been 2005, before. It would have been the same year, I think. It would have been 2004. I get called in by the chief of joint operations, and he says we've got a major crisis in the Sudan, where we had deployed troops, not under UN, but under the AU, under the African Union, in the Darfur region of Sudan. And there's been a very bad incident there, and we need to find out just what has happened. A platoon of South African soldiers had been escorting a convoy of fuel tankers from one point in Darfur to another. And they were stopped by a group of rebels who effectively ambushed them without firing a shot. And they captured all the fuel tankers, all the vehicles that the South African soldiers were on, took all their weapons, and they had to walk back on their own through the desert. And these guys went off with everything. And we want to find out what happened. So we're sending you with some other officers to go over and investigate this. So I had a team of, I think I had 2 colonels and a legal lieutenant colonel or major. I can't remember. I think there were 3 other guys who came with me. And we flew up to Khartoum, and from there we were flown out to El Fashir, and met the general. He was a Nigerian general in command of the operations there, and discussed some things with him. And then we were flown in a Russian helicopter out to where the sector in Darfur, where the South African battalion was deployed. And the sector commander was a South African. And I can't remember how long we spent there, 10 days, 2 weeks. It was quite a while we spent there because we had to do quite a concerted investigation. I won't go into too much detail about it, but what I will say is that the sector commander, who was a full colonel, had more or less sidelined the battalion commander, and he had insisted on briefing all the troops who were deployed personally before they went out in deployment. He'd sent this platoon out with this this convoy, and he told them that under no circumstances were they to open fire on the rebels. And then the rebels ambushed them and took everything. I took the platoon commander and with a protection escort and went out to the exact spot where it happened. I took a lot of photographs. I got the platoon commander to brief me and take me to every spot where everything had happened, show me exactly where the rebels had lain, how they'd sprung this ambush, how they'd surprised them, where they'd gone to when they left, and examined everything. It was quite an unusual environment for me because we didn't really operate much in the desert at all, except in the Kaoku Veld, which was a rocky sort of desert, not sandy desert. But it was a shocking business, and I cannot prove that there was any collusion anyway, but it was a highly suspicious situation. And while I was busy there, this one of the women on the staff of the South African headquarters came to me and asked if she could speak to me, and she did. And she told me that the colonel had been making advances on her and was pressurizing her with the intention of a sexual relationship. And she said she didn't know what to do. And so I said to her, well, you need to lay a charge against him. She said she's frightened to do that. She doesn't know how, what's going to happen to her. I mean, she's stuck in the middle of the Sahara Desert. She's thousands of kilometers away from home. She was feeling very, very vulnerable. Anyway, I spoke to the commander. He denied it. He insisted that there was no such thing happening. I went back to South Africa and submitted a report and briefed the Chief of Joint Operations. And I said to him, sir, this man needs to be relieved of his command immediately and never, ever given command of anything ever again. This man is a danger to the people who serve under him. He's a danger to South Africa. He's a highly questionable character. I don't know what his motives are. I don't know what his intention is, but he's going to get us into trouble. I believe the allegations that this woman has brought to me. I don't think that man should be left there a day longer because he's going to cause problems. The Chief of Joint Operations was very upset to hear this, thanked me very much, and so I left. They did nothing. They didn't want to take any decisions. They were hoping the problem would go away. I think it was about 2 months later, that that woman and another one apparently plucked up the courage to lay a charge because he'd gone too far. I think they laid a charge of assault. And whatever happened, I don't know what happened, but the next thing is that guy was brought back. He was bad news. And but I don't think anything was done to him. I think he got away with it. He was part of the army, not part of joint operations, but I saw him a few times in army headquarters when I went down there. When he'd see me, he would ignore me. He would pretend that I'm not there. He wouldn't acknowledge me, he wouldn't salute me, he wouldn't do anything. And I wasn't going to get involved in an issue with him because I would be accused of racism. So at least it was just satisfying to know that he'd finally been brought back and someone else had been sent up there in his place. But it was a shocking situation, and it was an unpleasant experience for me to go through that. I was grateful to have had the exposure to the situation in Sudan, and particularly in Darfur. And a number of the things that we did over there were quite memorable and were enjoyable, but there was a heavy cloud over that whole situation. And to this day, I have severe doubts about that man. I don't know what his intentions were, but they were not honorable. I have no doubt about that. Anyway, I was then Anne and I, my wife, we accompanied a delegation to visit the troops that were deployed in Burundi, in Sudan, and in the DRC over the Christmas period, just to give them gifts and to encourage them. And, the Surgeon General went with us and he gave a little pep talks and so on. It was very interesting. Anne enjoyed it. It was quite an experience for her to go to these places. Particularly Burundi and Sudan, I think she found that very, very interesting. So that was a nice little aside. I was asked to deliver the Turner Lecture at the Military Academy in 2006, which was quite an honor. And so I did. I spoke about the first South African to be trained as a paratrooper in the Second World War, a fellow called Captain David McComb. And it was when South Africa was planning to establish an airborne capability during the Second World War. They never could in the end because there were just not enough people. They needed people for the 6th Armored Division in Italy, so they had to disband the unit that a company that they'd established at that stage. But McComb was trained by the British in parachuting, in gliders, in various other aspects. And then ultimately, because of his qualifications, when South Africa decided not to have an airborne capability, he was seconded to the British Airborne Forces, and he jumped at Arnhem and participated in the action there. And he was one of the fortunate 2,000 who managed to get out of there at the end and cross the river and come back. He was wounded there quite badly and suffered from blackouts for the rest of his life as a result of his wound, because it was a head wound. But it was that was the content of the talk that I gave at the Military Academy. And then in 2006, just a year before I was due to retire, I was offered a study grant by UNISA. So I enrolled for my PhD and started to work on that, which is something that I'd been wanting to do. But I was now pushed into it by the by the study grant because it was a very useful sort of thing. In the end, it took me 10 years to finish that PhD, but I'll talk about that next time. I was then invited, quite surprised to be invited, because I'd met some of an Australian academic at one of the conferences at the military academy, the conferences where I'd presented papers. And he'd said to me he's going to arrange for me to come over to Australia and give a talk there. And, I didn't take it seriously. I mean, people always give you promises like that. But the next thing is I got an invitation to deliver a paper at a conference on the theory and conduct of small wars and insurgencies. And this was to be at the Royal Military College Doctrine in Canberra. So I took the papers through to the Chief of Joint Ops, and I said, look, I've got this invitation. Is it possible that the Defence Force can send me over on an official visit? And he was quite impressed when he saw this. And so I got authority to go over there. They wanted to know what the title was of my paper that I was going to deliver there. So I titled it, I wanted to speak about airborne operations in an insurgency war, you see, but I knew this is not going to go down well if they find that I'm going to be talking about the sort of operations that we did before democracy. So I titled my paper, The Liberation Struggle in Southern Africa. And then the subtitle was Airborne Tactics in an Insurgency War. They liked that. Of course, nobody was going to read my paper. So, they just looked at the title and said, that's great. You're going to talk about that. So I went over and in fact, my paper was eventually published because the proceedings of the conference were bound and published in Australia. And so there's a whole chapter of this book is my paper, which was quite a lengthy paper. It was a very good conference, particularly because a number of the other people who delivered papers there were people who I had read about, or I'd read their work. They were some were academics, some were retired military people who had actually written quite a bit about the Portuguese war in Angola and Mozambique and insurgency in northern in Ireland and various different things like that, which it was really good to meet those people and to spend time with them and held this informal discussions with them around the meals and the functions in the evening and so on. And it was great because it was an official visit for me. I wore my uniform while I was over there, and I met the Chief of Army and the Australian Chief of Army, who opened the conference proceedings and closed it again at the end. And I met a lot of interesting people there. And an Australian lieutenant colonel who had been working on his PhD, and wanted to look at our war, and he'd come over to South Africa, and he'd interviewed me and a number of other people, and I'd maintained contact with him, and he was based in Canberra, so he took me out to dinner one night, to him and his wife and his kids, and it was wonderful. So it was a great experience. I really enjoyed that. And little things like that, the visit to Spain and the visit to Australia and so on, were things that wouldn't have happened before 1994. So I was grateful that I did have that sort of opportunity. Then in March 2007, I reached the age of 60 and I retired. Now, my retirement, a one-star, in other words, a brigadier general, is not entitled to a parade when he retires. He's entitled to dining out. He can have a formal mess dinner, and he can invite people to that, and that's his farewell. A major general, he can have a parade, and they normally get a company to do a parade for him, and so on. And then lieutenant generals and higher, they have all sorts of big things for them. So there was just a dinner for me. That's the only thing. But at 44 Parachute Regiment, as it was then, I'd been attending all the exercises that they'd been involved in, and writing assessments of them, and giving them advice, and commenting on what they were doing, and attending their debriefs and so on. And they all knew me. And William Dixon and the other lieutenant colonels, the colonel in charge of the regiment was not so wildly enthusiastic about me. I'd had my differences with him, but he agreed to what the lieutenant colonels were suggesting. And the instigator was William Dixon, who got this whole thing going. My birthday is the 31st of March. So that's the last day of my service. But the 1st of April is the birthday of 1 Parachute Battalion. That's the day when 1 Parachute Battalion was established. And 1 Parachute Battalion has, or it had at that stage, a tradition. Ever since we had trooped the color on the 21st birthday of 1 Parachute Battalion, it had become a tradition for 1 Parachute Battalion to troop the color on their birthday, or as close to their birthday as possible. So I can't remember what day the 1st of April would fall on and my birthday would fall on, but it was in the week. And so the weekend before that was the weekend set aside for the 1 Parachute Battalion celebrations. So what they did was, for the trooping of the color, I was invited by the Parachute Regiment to take the salute for the trooping of the color, which was a great honor. But it was also, they had now engineered a farewell parade for me, because this would now be my farewell parade. And that was in the afternoon, on a Friday, I think it was. Friday evening, there was a dinner to which I invited a number of my close friends. And on the Saturday, there was a jump. And they'd arranged the last jump for me, and they had a Dakota aircraft, the same sort of aircraft that I'd done my first jump from. And this was set up for me. So I had some of my old school friends, some of who'd been to the paratroops, and invited them to come out, and they came down from Joburg, and one of the girls from the Girls' High, who was a good friend of mine, she flew up from Cape Town, especially for the parade. And I had numerous old paratroopers who'd served with me or under me in various, who were now out, they were civilians now. They'd taken severance packages, but they came along and attended the parade. And we had this marvelous parade in the stadium at Tempe, where I was able to take the salute. And it was really something special. And it was particularly special to me that the paratroopers had arranged this especially for me. I was able to do all of this and jump with them, and for a last time. I looked around at these guys, and there was a whole battalion on parade for the trooping of the color. And I did my inspection of the guys on parade and so on. And it was just quite emotional for me, walking down those ranks of paratroopers and looking at all those maroon berets. I just felt the emotion rising within me as I walked along. Anyway, the thought that went through my mind was, so I've now been excommunicated from the parachute fraternity. So why is the parachute fraternity giving me a battalion parade, trooping the color and arranging a last jump for me? Where are the guys who excommunicated me? How come they're not part of this? Anyway, that was my my retirement. And if it's okay with you, Koos, then I'll speak next time about my last stretch in the military, where I was in the reserve force, where I continued to play a role before I finally retired.
Well, thank you for that, sir. Thank you for your time as well. I wonder if somebody here wants to read your master's thesis. Where can they get hold of it? Because I do believe it's available. Or shall we put the link in and they can just download it and educate themselves?
Yeah, I can provide the link to you, and we can also just mention that it's available on UNISA's website. You can go into the website, you look for history department, you look for in fact, if you just Googled Kasinga raid, because it's called the Kasinga raid and my name, it would probably refer you to the website and directly to and it can be downloaded from the UNISA website. It can be acquired at no cost from the Bush War books, I think they call themselves. They have a number of publications which you can download, which don't cost you anything. And that is one of them. I'm not too sure, but I think the Bush War books version doesn't have the appendices. And that's unfortunate if that is the case. But the one from UNISA would have the appendices, because the appendices have got a lot of aerial photographs, other photographs, maps, and stuff like that, which just illustrate the dissertation quite well.
Well, thank you for that, sir. I really hope it will be a book one day. People should read it. It's fantastic. I read it myself. I actually did read it. And it really is good. But to the rest of you listening here, come and tell me your story. Don't let it die out. Let us get this history together. That other people who comes after us, perhaps they can learn from our mistakes if they were. And they can learn from our glory days as well, of which we were a great many. So until we meet again, God bless.